My name is Josh Goldstein, and I'm a director of the Berkeley Population Center. I am not the organizer of this wonderful meeting. Nora is, and she will soon take it away, but I just wanted to welcome everyone. The Berkeley Population Center is a resource we have on campus to bring together people from all over campus and around the Bay Area to work on areas of interest in population studies. This is, I would say, the fourth or fifth in a series of mini workshops we've had. We've had them on mortality and inequality, on population and big data. People help me. What else have we done? It's just many of you have been
Demography of the Great Recession.
Demography of the Great Recession. And now today we're doing population incarceration. Our next event, which we're just scheduling, will be a shorter event, an author meets critics event. Walter Scheidel from Stanford will come and speak on his new book on the long-term history of inequality. That's an approximate title, I'm not sure of the exact title. So that will be in February or March, and we'll have some Berkeley people respond to his book. So that's our next event. So welcome, everyone. Take it away, Nora.
Hi, good afternoon. So I'm Lorelai, and I am the Executive Director of the Berkeley Population Center, although in fact I actually do a lot of things on campus. So first of all, I want to thank everyone who's here and all the presenters for contributing their work. I first became interested in mass incarceration when I was prepping a sociology undergraduate course called Deviance and Social Control about 10 or so years ago. And at the time I learned that one of 3 young black men was in the criminal justice system. And so to paraphrase C. Wright Mills, when one person is imprisoned, it can be a personal flaw, but when it's 30%, we have a social force at an institutional level. So I redid my course into one of elite deviants. We started off with theories and then went into white-collar, corporate, medical, political, governmental deviants, and then into the drug war, and concluded with 2 weeks on mass incarceration, which is in part the result of the drug war. With such a large proportion of the population affected, then we are, and including their families and communities, then we are talking about something that's a demographic issue that's population-based. The reciprocal effects of mass incarceration on educational attainment, on labor force participation, on marriage and child-raising careers, and of course health, are all part of the research discourse. When I put forth a request for presenters, I wanted to have UC Berkeley faculty and from all over campus to get together. And indeed, that's what we have. We have 3 schools represented in our 5 presenters, plus a discussion moderator. We have letters and sciences, social welfare, and law school. And while I didn't specify any particular topic other than population incarceration, as it happens, all presentations are about the consequences and post-effects of mass incarceration. So I'd like this to be a collaborative experience for everybody, to think about and to discuss broadly about the connections that we're going to be hearing this afternoon, thinking about future research questions, and because of my role as director of Pop Center, about possibility of grants for research, and more in-depth conferences and or training. We will have opportunity after each talk to have a Q&A on that particular paper. But at the end, we will have a time to tie this all together. Amy Lerman from Poli-Sci is going to be leading that discussion. So save your questions section, we'll have that too.
How long will the talks be?
Talks are about 25 minutes, and then they'll give 10 minutes for Q&A after that. And I'm not going to be terribly rigid the way I would at a conference, but let's try to more or less keep to that. So let's get started. Our first talk is a theoretical piece, I think, incorporating demographic ideas and principles about decarceration with Anjali Verma, who's the Chancellor's postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Jurisprudence and Social Policy. And her research area is about prison downsizing and decarceration. Her dissertation looked at the California policy for public safety realignment. And take it away, Anjali. Thank you.
Such a pleasure to be here today, and I think, the argument
argument that I'm working out in this paper is an argument that probably many of the people in this room are already convinced of, which is essentially that we need to deploy population principles and demographic methods to study this phenomenon of decarceration. So these lines may be familiar to most of you. These are the opening lines to Preston et al.'s textbook. To a statistician, the term population refers to a collection of items, for example, balls and an urn. Demographers use the term in a similar way to denote the collection of persons alive at a specific point in time who meet certain criteria. So in a way, the textbook is introducing the sort of focal point or project of demography by analogy to statistics, by analogizing people at a specific point in time, according to a set of criteria, with the characteristics that a statistician is studying with the balls in the urn. But at the same time, that might be sort of a useful introductory heuristic to demography. It also seems to mask a deeper ontological difference between what the scholarly project is for a demographer who's essentially, that project is being described in terms of studying human beings alive in history, as opposed to studying the conditions and characteristics of items, the balls in history's urns. And so what I want to suggest is that the differences between demographic approaches and econometric approaches as a sort of predominant statistical approach to studying incarceration offer us something particularly useful at this moment in the early 21st century, when we have empirical occasion for the first time in over 40 years, really, during the era of mass incarceration, to ask a set of questions about prison downsizing and decarceration. So is decarceration even a word? Well, in 1977, when Andrew Scull wrote sort of one of the foundational books on decarceration, the opening lines to his book were, decarceration is a word which has not yet entered the dictionary, but it's increasingly being used to designate a process with momentous implications for all of us. Well, today, the word decarceration does not appear still in general reference dictionaries. You'll get a squiggly line on your word program. But the Oxford Dictionary of Sociology added an entry for decarceration in 2009. And first defines decarceration sort of as a tautology, the process of removing people from institutions such as prisons and mental hospitals, the opposite of incarceration. But then goes on to describe decarceration more in terms of the displacement of a prison population, saying another linked concept is transcarceration. We could ask, is that a word? In which people are moved sideways from one institution to another. So later on, Scull offers a sort of more cynical definition of this word, which has still not entered the dictionary. Decarceration, he writes, is shorthand for a state-sponsored policy of closing down asylums, prisons and reformatories. Mad people are being discharged or refused admission to the dumps in which they have traditionally been housed. Instead, they are to be left at large, to be coped with in the community. So these definitional difficulties around the word decarceration, I want to argue, are not just a matter of semantic nuance. We've not had the occasion, as I said before, for current generations of scholarship to really think and consider in a sustained way whether decarceration is actually a process that is something other than a tautology. Is decarceration a process that's something more than merely the opposite of decarceration, of incarceration? And if it is something more than that tautological definition, then how will our methods and theory around incarceration, sort of deployed over the past 40 years in an era of mass incarceration, apply to explaining this phenomenon of decarceration? And today I want to talk about, it's not just the stakes of determining what this word decarceration means, are not just sort of for popular discourse or policy discourse or advocacy discourse, as plenty of advocacy groups and policy audiences use this word and have all kinds of definitions for that word. I think what's of importance to us as researchers doing policy relevant research is the importance of defining decarceration as a theoretical construct in our research. So even if decarceration isn't a word in the general dictionary, it may be a social fact as we move on in the 21st century. You guys have probably seen these figures before. This is the overall prison population in the US for the first time since the beginning of mass incarceration in the early 70s began to stabilize. So we had the incarceration rate begin to decrease for the first time in 2007. And by 2009, we saw for the first time the actual population of prisoners decline. And this is just the rate of incarceration. As you can see, we're seeing a stabilization after 2010. And so most of these declines are actually a state and local story. So if I go back here, this green line is the federal prison population. So the declines in both rates and populations were largely driven by state-level prison systems. The federal prison system has continued only with the recent years dip as a kind of exception, has continued to rise apace. So something's going on at the state level. And California, in fact, in the last 3 years was the epicenter of this stabilization trend. In fact, declines in California's prison system alone accounted for 70% of the decrease in the nationwide stabilization of imprisonment. And last year continued to account for 50% of that decline. So understanding what's happening in California sort of suggests that we can start to understand what's happening with those national trends as well. So here, this is the total incarceration rate. This includes jails, so jails and prisons in California. As you can see, we have this kind of remarkable precipitous decline in the sort of mid-2000s. And it's not sort of changes in crime rates that explain this decline. It's actually changes in law. So you can see the enactment of 2 laws in particular are marked here. The first is public safety realignment, which was enacted in 2011. This was the state's response to a U.S. Supreme Court prison population cap order, Brown v. Plata, which ordered the state to bring its prison population down from over 200% of capacity to 137.5% of capacity, or by about 46,000 inmates, within a 2-year time frame. So the way that the state of California chose to comply, or one mode of compliance, was by essentially localizing the onus of compliance to each of the 58 counties in the state. So for all nonviolent, non-serious, non-sex registrable offenses in the state of California, under realignment, they will no longer be eligible for prison sentences. So counties will now have to choose either to incarcerate these offenses in their county jails, or for the first time since determinate sentencing in the state, this class of offenses would actually not necessarily need to be punished via incarceration. So counties have the option to use alternatives. So just sort of the simple kind of cut of these trends is it appears that the state, sort of total incarceration rate was already on the decline. Realignment happened and continued that decline. And then in 2014, the voters passed Proposition 47, which decriminalized 6 different felonies, reducing them to misdemeanors, property and drug crimes. So for those class of offenses, no term of incarceration would be the sentence any longer. So you can see a sort of even more steep downturn there after Prop 47. So the question is, going back to just this overall incarceration rate, would we call this decarceration? Would we call this decarceration? Well, if we look at the same time period where we have the actual population counts, okay, so not rates, of the state prison population, disaggregated from the county jail populations, we start to sort of see a few more puzzles here that would complicate sort of assigning the overall state trend a term like decarceration. Because what we see is that even as the state prison population was rapidly declining between this kind of realignment time period and the Prop 47 time period, what do we see the county jail populations doing? Sort of opposite trend. And so given the law changes under realignment, right, which localized the onus of incarceration from the state prison system to the 58 counties, we could say that these opposite trends here suggest the possibility of a TransInstitutionalization effect, or transcarceration, where what we're seeing under realignment in the state is not in fact decarceration, it's simply a relocation of the primary site of incarceration. But then, what's interesting is that with Proposition 47, which seemed to decarcerate using an entirely different mechanism, which was not to necessarily change the location of incarceration, but to actually decriminalize, meaning to remove the possibility of incarceration for a certain population of people, for a certain class of offenses. So there we see, after Prop 47, a decline in the state prison population, as well as a very steep decline in the county jail population, but then it returns and starts to tick up again. So with the Prop 47 trend sort of not being the exact kind of trans-institutionalization image that we saw under realignment, we can start to ask ourselves, well, perhaps trans-institutionalization, decriminalization, or diversion from incarceration in the first place are potentially all possible mechanisms for decarceration. So there's one way of thinking about decarceration if we want to think in terms of measures. Is decarceration a categorical measure? Can you have decarceration as well as trans-institutionalization? If decarceration is a categorical measure, if what we're seeing is both overall declines, but also a sort of change in the composition of locale where people are incarcerated, it becomes possible to think about the categorical outcome of decarceration being facilitated on some level by the mechanism of trans-institutionalization. So we could even think about if we treated decarceration as this categorical kind of variable, we would then maybe have subcodes for the different mechanisms by which we observe decarceration being achieved. TransInstitutional, and we would have to say, are these mutually exclusive mechanisms? A mechanism of TransInstitutionalization, a mechanism of diversion, a mechanism of decriminalization. So just this sort of very basic discussion of the difficulty in defining this construct of decarceration through the prism of what we've seen in California over the past decade or so, sort of reveals some of the building blocks of how we might really flesh out the construct of decarceration. And so just those very simple figures that I showed you, rates and populations across the state prison system, across the county jail system. So we have these dimensions of population, time, and space. So all I showed you were overall rates, overall counts. The only time period I showed you was from 2000 to 2016 with a focus on realignment going forward, which was in 2011. So this very limited time frame. And the units of analysis that I showed you, of course, were just these annual measures. So the totals for each year in that time frame. And then space, obviously we're talking about a sort of a state, one state. And within that state, we conceptualize the institutional locales of incarceration as prison or jail, or prison and jail. And then in terms of possible mechanisms, I talked about diversion, decriminalization, and transinstitutionalization. Another possible mechanism for these declines is simply that people are being released from carceral institutions. And even the mechanism of release has subcodes, you can imagine. Is that they're released because they were paroled or put on probation? Is it that they were early released by a sheriff? Another mechanism I could have put up there is less time served. And even that mechanism has subcodes. Why is less time served? Is it that sentences are shorter? Is it that people are being released early? So a lot of sticky questions. So the other sort of key definitional question in building this construct of decarceration and the measures that we would use to approximate it is whether we theoretically construct the concept as an outcome or as a process. So if we were to think of decarceration as an outcome, like an outcome variable, or a variable that measures the outcome of decarceration, we might define it as reductions across all systems of incarceration in a given time period and locale. And I'd in fact argue for that definition because it accounts for transinstitutionalization. So an abolitionist perspective on how we ought to theoretically construct the meaning of decarceration would proceed from the premise that we want less bodies in cages at the end of the day, regardless of where those cages are located, how those cages are organized across different institutions. And then if we were to construct decarceration as a processual concept, we might define it accordingly as the process by which incarceration is reduced across all systems of incarceration in a given time period and locale. So I want to suggest that these two different ways of framing the construct of decarceration kind of go back to those introductory lines of the Preston et al. Textbook, where in a sense we can study decarceration as a thing, a ball and an urn, right, that has characteristics and context that make it more or less likely. So decarceration as an outcome is kind of like decarceration is a condition, or it is it's a condition of things and predict through the characteristics of other things, right? So that's, the variable as the outcome, but we could also conceptualize decarceration as this outcome that could explain other things. So this variable, decarceration, could also be an explanatory variable. And so this is very common, right? In research where crime or recidivism is the outcome of interest, one of the explanatory variables that you want to include in your model is whether incarceration rates are going up or down. So you can imagine that a reduction in incarceration would go into your model here. But so what about decarceration as a process? So the distinction there is that decarceration as a process is something that happens when a cumulative set of risks or conditions occur. Decarceration would be a product of a process, an accumulation of things that would predict decarceration. And so this sort of starts to get at the distinction, I think, ontologically between an econometric approach to considering decarceration and a population and demography approach. And I'm suggesting that a demographer would tend to think about this construct in terms of process. That the way in which we would model and measure decarceration would have to do with the change in populations at risk, moving sort of sequentially through a set of processes that make decarceration more or less likely. I'll just keep talking. During the sort of comments and questions, I would definitely like to hear people's thoughts about whether that ontological distinction between studying decarceration as an outcome or a process makes sense to you, and then also whether it makes sense to you the way in which I've mapped that on to the kind of econometric set of methods and the demographic set of methods. And of course, there are several people here in this room, including David Harding, who have studied incarceration as a process and modeled this kind of cumulative set of risks that a population goes through, and the ultimate product is going to be incarceration. And so I want to sort of suggest that the demographic consideration of decarceration so far is incredibly distinct from the econometric studies of decarceration. And there's one particular study and measure in particular I wanted to use to demonstrate my point, which would really need to be visual. So I'll just keep talking. So this is a study by Magnus Lofstrom and Steve Raphael of California's Realignment, a 2013 study. And their research question was, essentially, has California's realignment led to decarceration or transinstitutionalization? And they also looked at the variation across counties in how we might answer that question. And so the measures that they developed for decarceration and to measure transinstitutionalization are really interesting, given this sort of theoretical discussion about all of the different ways that we could conceptualize decarceration. And so one of their measures, so I'll just give a quick summary of their findings, and then hopefully by then I can get to the measures they used to get there. So their first finding was that just using very basic descriptive data on populations at the statewide prison level and across counties, they found that in the first 9 months of realignment, that although the state prison population had declined by about 26,000 people, the county jail population had increased by about 8,600 people. And so that's just a description that suggests, right, a transinstitutionalization effect it suggests that about a third of the people who would have been imprisoned in the state prison were incarcerated in a county jail. But in order to isolate the effects of realignment, they had to deal with a number of confounders. So the sort of major confounder is, well, what is the baseline? So if you're looking at a pre-post realignment time period, how would you know which populations in a time period before would have been at risk for state imprisonment and eligible to be classified as a realigned offender? And that would be the only way to kind of begin to isolate the effects of this one law. So in demography, we might think about that as, how do I standardize my rates, right, across two populations at different time periods? And okay, so here we go. And the other confounder is they have to somehow model all of the other factors, all of the other trends, this what they call seasonal variations and seasonal effects that would have happened in a counterfactual world in which these law changes didn't happen. And so through a series of regression analyses using difference in difference measures, they attempt to isolate the effects of realignment, which essentially comes down to dealing with this confounder of, how do I standardize across two populations in different time periods, and how do I decompose or isolate the effect of realignment? So these two kind of analytical and measurement challenges of standardizing across populations and decomposing effects are, I want to suggest, things that demography does better than econometrics in terms of questions that have to do with population migration, bodies moving through space and time and across institutional locales. So Lofstrom and Raphael actually exploit what they call the different realignment doses in each of California's 58 counties. Which is, so again, going back to what the law did, it said all non-violent, non-serious, non-sex registrable offenders that would have previously gone to state prison are now the county's responsibility. So the counties varied immensely in terms of their rate of state prison use in the decade, and many decades back, I'm only showing you the decade, in the decade preceding realignment. So this is an average of the per capita state prison admissions by county from 2000 to 2010. So as you can see, the reliance on the state prison system was incredibly varied across counties. And as Lofstrom and Raphael correctly point out, then the dose of realignment is going to be different. So a county like Kings County is going to have a very, very high number per capita of realigned offenders that they will have to decide to either incarcerate in a county jail or deal with through some kind of alternative supervision system. So they take measures of each county's state prison incarceration rate over their monthly time period points in the pre-post realignment time periods. And then same thing with the county jail incarceration rate. And so then what they're simply doing is taking the change in the pre-post realignment time periods in jail incarceration and state prison incarceration. And to get at the intense variation across counties, their overall finding is that for every one offender no longer sent to state prison under realignment, there are 3 who are transferred to county jail instead. So what they've been able to do is come up with a rate of TransInstitutionalization, a prison to jail transfer rate. I said that backwards. For every 3 offenders not sent to state prison, 1 is transferred to county jail. So there's not a one-to-one transinstitutionalization effect going on in the state. there is something like a 3-to-1. So would we call that decarceration? It sort of goes back to this conceptual question. It seems like we could argue that we could define that as decarceration with a little transinstitutionalization mixed in. But that's an overall description of transinstitutionalization state. But what if I wanted to know what that transfer looked like per county, which for policymakers and for advocates might be incredibly useful information, especially if you have the benefit of arraying the decarceration and transinstitutionalization rates for your county compared to other counties. So they offer this ratio as a way for doing this. It's called the jail use response ratio, where it's simply the change in the county's jail incarceration rate pre-post realignment over the change in the state prison incarceration rate pre-post realignment. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up in a moment. So when this ratio yields a -1, that would represent an increase in the jail population by 1 for every offender not sent to state prison or a 1-to-1 transfer. So this is just an array of the counties by this ratio, where all the counties on this side of the line are indicating some kind of transinstitutionalization and some kind of decarceration. With even counties who are incarcerating less people in county jails than they were before, even given a reduction in sending people to state prison. So who would we assign decarceration sort of in our theoretical construct across this array? But the problem with their ratio, and I'm going to end with the problem and just say that I think demography could help, and we could talk about how. The problem with this ratio, and this is a problem I encountered when I tried to use this ratio in my own research, is that if it's true that we interpret this ratio when it's a -1 as a 1-to-1 transfer rate, a 1-to-1 transinstitutionalization rate, these are all the theoretical possibilities of what could have happened under realignment. Jail could have gone up, even as prison went up. We observe that in their data. Jail could go up while prison can go down. We observe that, but from their measure, we know what the direction of these populations are, but we don't know if the increases or decreases offset each other, which is theoretically and empirically important if we're going to call this decarceration or transinstitutionalization, and so on and so on. But like mathematically, things start to get tricky when you have no change, either in the prison levels or the jail levels. And so none of that really mattered in Wasser and Raphael's study because the data that they had didn't sort of wade into any of these mathematical difficulties. The data they had also didn't create the puzzle of something that looks like transinstitutionalization with a negative sign happens when you have jail going up and prison going down, but you would get the same sign when you have jail going down and prison up. So all it tells us is that we have transinstitutionalization, but not in which direction we have it. So, moving. All of the sort of measures, right, that were used in this one econometric approach to studying decarceration, which I've just used as one demonstration, are dealing with the confounders of standardizing rates across populations and decomposing or isolating effects. I don't think that the econometric mode of analysis is really set up to measure decarceration as a process that's occurring across time and space. I think that demography has better models for dealing with these two issues through decomposition analysis and also ways of benchmarking and creating weights that standardize populations. And finally, I think that demography actually has more well-developed theory about how to first conceptualize, but then operationalize and measure population processes, right? Which are they're processes. They're not conditions. They're processes that are occurring over time. Institutional migrations is a process. Changes in the population at risk of what you're trying to explain, and finally changes in the composition of that population at risk. Thank you.
Well, we have about 10 minutes for questions. Get started. I have a question. Someone has to ask a question, so I will. So I have two questions, actually. One is, if the motivation for the realignment was crowding, so could I can call it transcarceration?
Sure.
Could that be effective and would make people feel like some goal has been accomplished? And the second question is, since California is driving a lot of the decline in sort of the total state, but really was moving them around, what's happening in the other states? Are they also doing those kinds of mechanisms of kind of moving pieces around from one place to the other?
Well, so yes, realignment was a response to a court order about reducing prison overcrowding. I think the answer to your question, which was essentially, well, is transcarceration or transinstitutionalization, isn't that a solution if it actually did result in a reduction in the prison overcrowding problem, which it did. But I think the answer to your question is normative. I mean, I think, so from a more abolitionist-oriented critique of the criminal justice system, which is where I proceed from, I don't think that it's a solution, because in fact, you will have the potential to create 58 mini 8th Amendment constitutional violations, and in fact, 20 of California's 58 counties were already under population caps because they were overcrowded. So I think that it's not practical, I think, to say that transcarceration is a solution.
I'm not recommending
No,
it.
I know, but I'm just kind of going through the levels and how you would think that through. I mean, I don't think it's a practical solution, because I think it's just a matter of time until you replicate the legal issues. Normatively, I think anyone living in an overcrowded situation, it's still a human rights issue, whether it's a prison or jail.
The other states, what's happening?
The other states. So there are only 4 other states that have exhibited declines in both population and rate over this time period. And one of the sort of stakes around understanding what's happening with California's realignment is this idea of policy devolution, of localizing incarceration, as something that other states are watching California to see, A, does it work? B, will there be all of these mini rounding plazas at the county level? My home state of Alabama thought of implementing a realignment and then decided not to once 4 lawsuits were filed at the county level here. So I think it's certainly a matter of time before a number of states that are on the precipice of really exceeding their institutional capacity to the extent that California did will either be sued or will sort of preempt lawsuits. And the big question is how? Like, how do we achieve decarceration? Do we do it through diversion, decriminalization, shorter sentences, less time served? All these mechanisms are policy relevant, sort of beyond this theoretical discussion that I have, because it's like, which legislation do we want to write? Which policy reforms do we want to enact?
So I certainly agree. I think demographic analysis could be very helpful, and I think there are papers out there which I'm not familiar with. Like I think Carl Schmertman did a paper on prison populations, but I think it would be nice to have a baseline demographic analysis where you could see what would happen if there weren't any policy changes. There'd be some things happening just because the population is aging,
Right.
for example, or because of the timing of surges in intake into the prisons. Those people are going to be aging out of the prisons at some point. Or, and then if there were a reduction in the rate of intake for some reasons, then the incarceration proportion would drop. Would we call that decarceration? It has a different flavor than sort of getting people who are sentenced to remain in out in some way. That's a different, more policy-driven or differently policy-driven
Yeah.
type of intervention.
So, for example, David Harding and his colleague, last name Winship, have a 2016 paper where they present this kind of basic accounting model where you start with the people at risk of incarceration, and the people who are at risk are people who commit criminal offenses. And then they have a series of sort of sequential steps where you can become more or less at risk. We could think of those steps as places where you could get diverted, right, if the law is changed in certain ways. What I think is really interesting theoretically about posing this question of, is decarceration something more than just the opposite of incarceration? How might we have to change that basic accounting model that seems to underlie a lot of demographic approaches to studying imprisonment in general? How might we change that model? Well, one example would be that we have something that goes even before that first step of a person commits a crime to become at risk, which is we have a set of definitions of what counts as crime. And the composition of behaviors that count as crime or not, and that carry longer or shorter sentences, is also that's a compositional issue, right, that we need to account for. And what we see with one possibility that we saw in sort of the empirical case of California with Proposition 47 would be a very clear example of a change in definitions of crime that are prison or jail eligible. And so I'm really interested in sort of what are the modeling implications of getting before what had previously been thought of as this black box of like, we don't really know the universe of people who commit crimes and don't get caught, right? But we do know the universe of things that count as crime and don't, and we can track changes in that. So that seems to implicate the model. But I think conceptually it seems kind of straightforward to work that into a demographic analysis. With an econometric analysis, it just gets so messy because you have to net that out, right? You have to net out the effect of changes in definitions of crime, which is kind of weird because we're trying to explain how this process happens, not that it happens net of X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E. So.
More time later on. Okay, so. All right, our next speaker is David Harding, who's going to talk about incarceration and mortality. So, just to introduce you, David Harding is an associate professor in sociology. His interests include poverty and inequality, urban neighborhoods, education, incarceration, prisoner reentry, using both qualitative and quantitative methods. And his current projects, partly what you're going to hear, include the social and economic reintegration of former prisoners, neighborhoods, effects of incarceration on crime, employment, and health, and all kinds of other things. I'd rather read the whole description, but he does lots of stuff. So, welcome to David. As soon as he gets his PowerPoint slide up there.
Okay, well, I can
Just keep talking.
So there we go, great. So I guess I should acknowledge my co-authors here. So this is part of a project that I've been working on, gosh, for 10 years now in various forms with Jeff Mornoff from the University of Michigan. We've collected a lot of data on prisoner reentry and incarceration in Michigan. This is sort of one of the latest things we're working on, and we've enlisted An, who's a Michigan grad student, and Ingrid Binswanger, who's a doctor and medical researcher. And so what we're trying to do in this paper, or soon-to-be paper, currently PowerPoint slides, is to just sort of make an initial foray into understanding the relationship between imprisonment and mortality. So we're going to talk about prisons and not jails. And to sort of leverage the size of the data, a a good comparison group, and information about cause of death to try to understand what some of the processes are, at least in a descriptive or approximate sense in terms of effects of incarceration on mortality. So a little bit of background. Oh, I should also say I have a little bit of a cold, so if people in the back have trouble hearing me, just let me know. I'll try to talk a little louder. So this is sort of a little bit of background and motivation. Basically, we know from the existing research that individuals who experience incarceration are considerably less healthy than those who do not. It extends on almost every domain of health that we can look at: mental health, substance abuse, chronic medical conditions, from cardiovascular disease to asthma, infectious diseases like HIV, hepatitis C, and so on. We know that the weeks immediately after release from prison are particularly risky, especially with regard to overdose deaths. And we also know that prison itself appears to be protective of someone's health. So the time when you're actually in prison is a time when you're protected at least from death. And it's especially the case for black men, owing in part to the difficult health conditions in communities for them. And so there's some research that tries to condition on observed covariates, and that suggests that there is potentially a causal effect of imprisonment on health, and some slight evidence this is a little bit larger for women than men. So we think there's many unanswered questions here. The first one is that this literature has almost exclusively focused on prison. What about other forms of criminal justice system involvement? A lot of the mechanisms are theorized but not really studied empirically, and the causal relationships are uncertain here. Of course, people who go to prison are probably at greatest health risk to start with. So is this really about prison or about the type of people who end up in prison and their past experiences? So our study is based on a very large sample of individuals convicted of a felony and then followed for 7 to 10 years. So we're picking up people not just who go to prison, but to get other types of sentences for a felony. This is data from Michigan. What I'm going to show you today is just this kind of fairly straightforward descriptive analysis looking at variation in cause of death in whether this population has been in prison, and looking at the role of what we call churning and moving in and out of prison. And so this is sort of our first step, and our eventual goal is to get to kind of a natural experiment-based design where we can get at the causality better by using the random assignment of judges to get exogenous variation in incarceration. That's
So some of the people convicted of felony don't go to prison?
Yes, exactly. You can be sentenced to probation or to jail as well. Okay, so let's sort of talk about what the mechanisms are that are discussed in the literature. The negative, and so I'm dividing this up into the way prison might affect your health, particularly mortality, in the moment you're in prison, cumulative effects of that would persist, presumably after you've come out of prison, but are based on how long you've been in prison, and then also on sort of churning in and out of prison. Right? So this is the revolving door of prison that Julie also referred to. So we think there could be negative effects because of the context of prison itself is a very negative mental health environment, very stressful environment. And then that stress can kind of accumulate over time and lead to cardiovascular risk, cancer risk, and so on. There's not much autonomy in the prison environment to manage your own care. And then, of course, it's very limited social support in the prison environment, especially the separation from family. Of course, the longer you're in prison, the more exposed you are to communicable diseases. That's a big concern in an enclosed prison environment, and the longer you're in prison, the less social support you have. And then the churning in and out, we could be concerned about the sort of stress that's created by that, by trying to reestablish your life when you come out, by transitions in healthcare, right? So moving out of the prison healthcare system, finding healthcare in the community, so-called continuity of care is a huge problem. While you're in prison, you can lose your tolerance to alcohol and drugs leading to overdose, and you can sort of lose your social relationships that protect you from violence, and particularly in poor communities. And we might also think there are some potentially positive effects of prison for people's health. these basically have to do with two things. One is the controlled environment of prison, and two is the possibility of getting health care in prison that you would not have gotten in the community. So the controlled environment, of course, reduces, though does not eliminate, your exposure to alcohol and drugs, limits your exposure to things like violence and accidents, right? So if we think about young men, one of the major causes of death is traffic accidents. You're going to be protected from that for the most part. And then you can get health care in the prison, and you can get stable food and shelter. If you're in prison for a long time, the sustained exposure to health care and disease management could be potentially helpful. That, of course, depends on the quality. And then every time you go in and out of prison, you're often assessed for health problems. And so you may be more likely than if you had not gone to prison to identify health problems and then therefore be able to treat them. So there's sort of these possible counter effects. Okay, quickly on our data. So we're doing a longitudinal cohort study. We sampled or selected all people with a new felony conviction in Michigan between 2003 and 2006, and then followed them over time using the administrative records of the Department of Corrections. And so these are people who have been sentenced either to prison, jail, and then probation, or probation, and there's a very small group of people who get something else, like fines or community service. We're mostly going to drop those people. And then we identify their deaths and the cause of death using the National Death Index, matched through 2012. And so we're going to do a kind of a descriptive analysis using standardized mortality ratios, indirect standardization using age, race, and gender, to compare this population of people to the general population of Michigan, standardize on those things. And then the second set of methods are going to be comparing within this population, the criminal justice system involved population, to look at, to do various event history models to look at death as the outcome. Okay, so who are we talking about here? This is a very disadvantaged population, as you won't be surprised to hear, although they are quite young, from a health perspective, on average. 41% completed less than high school. That does not include the GED. Only a third were formally employed before they were sentenced. About 20% have a history of mental health problems. That's surely an understatement because that's a self-report. 86% have any history of drug use. 12% have any history of opioid use. Opioids are going to be the biggest risk of overdose deaths. 67% alcohol use. Lots of controlled substance drug convictions, not surprisingly, but also lots of violent crime convictions. And we know that one of the biggest risks for being victimized yourself, that sort of violent victimization and violent crime kind of go together. So this is a very much a population that's going to be at high risk of health problems. Okay, so comparisons with the general population. I don't know how well you guys can see this in the back. So what I have here is the top line is all deaths, and then I have the death rate and the standardized mortality rate. So this population, over the time period we observe them, has about double the probability of death compared to the general Michigan population, which we standardize on age, race, and gender. And this is the death rate if you're used to seeing such rates, quite high. And then, so what we've done is broken this down just so we understand what's going on. But the deaths is by cause of death. And so we're generally dividing these deaths into external or injury deaths, which are in blue, and then illness deaths, or quote-unquote internal deaths, which are in blue. And so what I've got, they're ordered by the SMRs, right? So where the risk is greatest relative to the general population. But I've also shown you the death rate. So those don't always correspond. So for example, cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death in our population, our sample of convicted felons. But that's actually sort of a relatively low SMR, at least relative to the other things here. All of these are quite high, I think by usual SMR standards. So we can see huge SMRs, almost 7 for overdose, 3 for homicide, almost 3 for suicide, other accidents, and so on. And so we just give you a chance to look at this. Let's see, even transportation accidents. Okay.
So those are adjusting for age and
Age,
race,
yeah, age, race,
ethnicity,
gender.
and
Yeah, age, race, gender.
gender. Wow.
Yeah.
So you're still 3 times as likely to die in prison from homicide, for example.
This is not dying in prison. This is just the population of people who have been sentenced for a felony. So some of these people are going to prison. Yeah. So the death rate, yeah, I'll show you that the probability of dying in prison from homicide is very low.
Yeah, okay.
As we would hope. Okay, so the first thing we did was just to look at people's initial sentences, and according to these 5 categories, and right away, well, we shouldn't have been puzzled, but I guess we were sort of puzzled by all these SMRs are large, right? So anything over 1 means you're more at risk than the general population, but the prison SMR is actually the low relative to these other sentences, and this residual category is quite small, so the confidence interval is huge. But so we were sort of first puzzled by this, right? Then we decided that we need to sort of essentially try to follow people over time and see what was actually happening to them. Because it turns out that even if you're originally sentenced to jail or jail with probation or probation, your risk of going to prison at some point in the future during our 10-year time span is quite high. So this initial distinction by sentence type is not really sort of what's key here to understanding incarceration. When we look at, when we break down the time periods and sort of classify them by whether you're currently in prison or whether you're currently not in prison in the community, which can also include being in jail, because we can't see when you're in jail, we see the pattern we might have expected, which is that being in prison, no matter what your original sentence was, is highly protected, right? The SMRs are below 1. Protected relative, we're not just talking about relative to other people in this population, but relative to the general Michigan population, whereas the high risk is in the period in the community. At least for that one. Okay, so from here forward, we're kind of going to abandon this distinction as not that useful.
So
Yeah.
this is telling us that you're better off being a felon in prison than a non-felon in terms of your chance of
Yeah,
dying?
adjusted for age, race, and gender, but yeah. Yes. Well, let's look at why. Yeah, right, what's going on here, right? So let's look at injuries first, right? So quite a bit of this is driven by the protective effect of being in this very controlled prison environment. Okay? So you can't get in traffic accidents, your access to drugs is very low, your overdose risk is low, your risk of homicide even, it doesn't sound like it from watching television, is quite low. Other external causes not quite significant, but also looks low, right? So we see big protective effects of being in prison on these sort of external cause deaths, and so that's probably not surprising, especially people who study this sort of stuff in the literature. The illness may be a little bit more surprising. So I don't know how well the people in the back can see this, but so we have cancer here. It's just barely protective. The confidence interval doesn't quite touch 1 being in prison. Cardiovascular disease, you're protected. Respiratory disease, there's no difference between being in prison and the general population. Liver and kidney diseases looked protected, but not quite significant. And then the one place where being in prison is higher risk is viral hepatitis C and other infectious diseases. Okay, so there's something more to the in-prison story than just the controlled environment, which is sort of what got us thinking about some of the healthcare issues too, right? So if you have cardiovascular disease, and you're actually getting your high blood pressure or cholesterol medication while you're in prison, that might happen. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears and we're going to compare compare among the felony population. Okay, so we're going to estimate Cox proportional hazards models where the outcome, of these is all-cause mortality, and then we're going to run competing risk regressions when we get into the cause-specific mortality. And the things I want to focus on are these 3 variables, and we have a bunch of controls. The 3 variables are you currently in prison during the time here is month. Are you currently in prison in that month, or what proportion of the month? How many months have you cumulatively been in prison in our study period? And then how many times have you entered prison? So how much churning are we seeing? And then we control for those initial sentence types, the year you were sentenced, county fixed effects, various criminal history measures, demographic measures, human capital measures, and some health indicators. Those mainly substance use, mental health, and we're also able to get BMI off of people's criminal history by weight and height. So anyway, there's a few more details on there for you cost proportional hazard modelers. Let's look at the results on these 3 key variables. Okay, so these are, I've shown the results in hazard ratios, right? So they're anything less than 1 is a reduction in your risk of mortality. Anything greater than 1 is an increase. And not surprisingly, we see that even among this population, being in prison is quite protective. That's a pretty large hazard ratio. We have cumulative time in prison in a very flexible functional form. It turns out the linear term is really dominating the direction of the effects. But so the more time you've been in prison, the less your probability of death, which is a little bit surprising given the cumulative stress story that's often told in the literature. But I'll come back to that. The thing that increases your risk of death apparently is the churning in and out of prison. So relative to 0 entries into prison, each additional entry seems to increase your risk of death. We've also tried interacting all these variables, and none of the interactions. All right, so those are hard to look at and kind of get a sense of the magnitude. So here's some essentially predicted values coming out of the regression. So this is for whether you're currently in prison. So if we follow people for our full study time, which is 10 years or 120 months, these are the differences in the survivor functions, right? So this is the proportion of people who are still alive at each time point. And so you can see that the gap is about 3 or 4 percentage points down at the end. So this is survival by time in prison. So remember this was also a kind of a negative effect on mortality. So your probability of survival is highest the more time you've been in prison, and then as the time in prison shrinks, the survival goes down.
Is this including the churn effect of going to prison in the first place?
This is controlling for the churn effect. Yes.
So you take out the fact that you...
Yeah, so this is sort of really like if someone was in prison for this entire time straight.
So 0 is like epsilon. You go to prison, but you're let out immediately. Compared to...
Yeah, there are people who haven't been in prison. Right? There's some people in the data who've never been in prison.
These are all felony sentences.
These are all felony sentences.
Yeah, but you haven't given the people with 0 months a 0 churn effect in this, right? Otherwise, they would have lower hazards, at least at the beginning. It doesn't.
Yeah, let's come back. I think this is you're just asking how am I creating the predictions
Yeah.
and lines, right? Okay. Okay, and then this is sort of the churn effect, right? So people who have never been to prison are here, and you can see the difference in mortality. It's about one percentage point between 1 and 2 or more. There's only a few people who have 3, so we want them with 2 or more, and then a big gap there.
This is prison and jail.
This is only prison. Only prison.
Only prison.
Yeah. You can't observe jail, unfortunately, in these data because they're county jails. Okay, so anyway, that's just to try to give you a sense of the magnitude of the effects for all cause of mortality. So let me switch now to looking at specific causes of death. We're going to be doing these competing risk regressions. So I'm changing the orientation of how I'm presenting the results here. So now each row is going to be a regression model. And so this is actually the Cox model stuff I've already shown you. And this is the coefficient on current prison, hazard rates, the linear term from cumulative time in prison, and then the one admission and two or more admissions. So the last two columns are mature. So those are the results we've already seen, but they're just here for benchmark. Okay? So each row is going to be a competing risk regression. We're focusing on one particular cause of death and we're thinking of other causes of death as competing risks. So we can see that these are all of our injury or external causes of death. They're all quite a bit lower. So dramatically lower risk of those things as we would expect. And then, as I think we would expect, there's really no effective cumulative time in prison on these things, right? So once you're out of prison, you're not really, there's no protection from those. And the standard errors are a little bit large, but we see that the more times you've churned in and out of prison, the higher risk you are for suicide, and the higher risk you are for death by homicide. And we get sort of suggestive, potentially suggestive effects on the other ones, but they're not statistically significant.
David, how do we interpret that one admission coefficient? I guess this is getting back to what Josh was asking.
Yeah. I mean, if you guys have suggestions about how to better set up the models.
That's a contrast to someone who's a felon but never goes to prison?
Yeah, so someone,
So
we've
that's
actually
a very
run this,
selective-
we've run this two different ways. The version you're seeing here, any admission to prison, including the one from the first sentence, is counted. We've also run it where we sort of ignore the first one, the one that comes from the first prison sentence, and only count subsequent ones, and the results come out pretty much exactly the same. So, but yeah, so this is just these are just dummy variables in the model. Have you had one admission in the past? These are all time-varying variables, rather compared to 0, or 2 or more admissions compared to 0. So this might be a mental health kind of effect of these prison transitions. The homicide effect, I think, has been seen before, right? Because you come out of prison, your social networks that sort of protect you and tell you about risks of violence in the community are reestablished. Okay, so then let's look at the illness, or quote-unquote internal causes of death. So being in prison protects you from death for cardiovascular disease and other non-infectious diseases, which is a real kind of hodgepodge of things, so it's hard to know what that means. And they're sort of suggestive hazard ratios, but not statistically significant. So cumulative time in prison also protects you from cardiovascular disease and liver or kidney disease. And again, other non-infectious diseases. So this is probably some combination of the healthcare you've gotten in prison over time, and for liver or kidney disease, for lack of access to alcohol. But the churning, so that even for these external these illnesses, we get a lot of churning effects, which we're kind of interpreting in part as the effect of the continuity of care problem, right? Your risk goes up for cancer, cardiovascular disease, liver or kidney disease, and other infectious diseases. The one big exception is HIV. So the more times you've been in prison, the less risk you have of dying of HIV. We think, I mean, this is just speculation, but we think this is because every time you enter prison, you're tested for HIV, along with being tested for lots of other stuff. And you do receive HIV treatment in prison. And so certainly the biggest, most important thing for surviving HIV is knowing that you have it and starting to get treatment for it. So this is sort of that one piece of evidence of a health assessment there. Okay, so let me just summarize where we've been. Mortality rates for people sentenced for a felony are high compared with the general population for all causes, but especially for overdose, homicide and suicide, transportation accidents and other accidents, respiratory diseases, liver and kidney diseases, HIV. The disparity between sentenced individuals and the general population is really about the time those people are in the community. Time in prison is protective for mortality, but the churn in and out is associated with greater mortality. And so the way we interpret these results is not necessarily about something that's going on in the prison per se, but really about what people's health, environment, and healthcare options are like when they are not in prison, which is quite a difficult challenge for this population. Okay, so and then thinking about causes of death, right? The controlled environment of prison appears highly protective especially against injury causes of death. And our interpretation is that access to prison healthcare appears to reduce mortality due to sort of readily treatable diseases like cardiovascular diseases, infectious diseases, liver or kidney disease, where your life can be prolonged if you're on your treatment. Churning in and out of prison increases the risk of homicide and suicide, and for the reasons I talked about. Again, this is our interpretation. And we think that interruptions in healthcare due to the churning are what's going on for things like cancer, cardiovascular disease, and so on. We saw this HIV effect due to the testing. Okay, so let me just remind you of some limitations here. We're looking at one state in the U.S., and criminal justice policies especially differ a lot from state to state. And Michigan is also one of the most segregated states in the country, as you probably know. We've only followed people for up to 10 years, right? So if we really wanted to test this stress kind of effect, we would want to be able to follow people longer, but we're kind of bumped up against the present time. We're not looking at jail incarceration at all. We're just tracking people's movements in and out of prison. Obviously, there's a lot of other health issues that aren't captured by mortality. And we have, as you saw, we have sort of a low power to detect especially rarer causes of death. We've just looked at proximate mechanisms, right? We're not testing people's stress by taking blood samples or something like that. And we haven't yet started to look at race, age, and gender. The effects I can tell you are sort of more dramatic for African American men. And any sort of causal story here is about assuming selection on observables. We have very good we have a lot of variables that sort of are good at predicting selection into prison, like people's criminal history, which is the main driver of and their offense severity, but we don't have very good measures of people's health, other than the mental health and substance abuse, which is self. Okay, so I'm just going to close with policy implications. I think the most important one here is that if we're starting to think about the criminal justice system and health and where we should intervene, it would be a mistake to focus on only on prisoners. Right? That everybody who's involved in the criminal justice system, at least this level of being a felony offender, is at very high risk. And so we need to be targeting those people as well. It seems like we're thinking about prison specifically, and whether this applies to jail as well, we can't tell from our data, but this churning might need to be minimized, and doing so might have important health benefits. So diversion programs, avoiding imprisonment for minor violations, and so on. Of course, there's a whole literature and criminology on those things. And then we might also think, if we're thinking about providing health services in prison, we might want those to be oriented sort of more forward-looking, sort of beyond when someone just is in prison, but preparing people to manage their health problems when they leave, better connecting them to health services post-release, making sure they get vaccines, and so on. That's where I'll stop. Thank you.
So you said that this is telling us a lot about the sort of mortality consequences of growing up in a poor neighborhood. And so I was just wondering if you have like the power, the variation, or the data to look at heterogeneity by the types of neighborhoods people come from. I mean, maybe everyone here is coming from a poor neighborhood, which is something we know.
I would. There's certainly going to be variation. Given that we're working with 145,000 people, and there's no readily available data on what neighborhoods they come from. We can't do that with this data. We have a parole reentry sample where we can look at neighborhoods. We haven't looked at that yet, but that's a good idea. And there is quite a lot of variation, even in that, even in people coming out of prison, what neighborhoods they're in.
Yeah, a couple questions. You can pick which you'd like to answer.
Okay.
But around churn, to clarify, does that include facility transfers? When you said admission to...
Oh yeah, no, that does not include facility transfers.
Okay, because
That's
particularly
just
with
in and out of
continuity of
prison.
care.
Yeah.
Got you,
Yeah.
okay. And then even for those who are in and out of state prison, being out of prison does not mean you're out from under criminal justice supervision. And by that I mean
Right.
your analyses regularly, blood tests, etc. So you're still tapped in some way around check-ins with regards to your health.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
more
yeah.
for surveillance than it is for rehab per se, I'd argue. But something to think about. Out doesn't mean alone.
Right, no, it doesn't.
Out doesn't mean not touched.
This is
So I'm
this
just
is what
curious.
Heather's going to talk about in the next.
Beautiful.
I'm not gonna
Not
actually-
steal your thunder.
Yes, but
Okay.
you are on.
Okay, no
You are on
problem.
parole, and you are
And
being
probation.
and monitored. You could be
That's
on
right.
probation. Yeah.
That's right. Okay, we were gonna wait for Heather. And then my last brief question around the way you parceled out internal injury versus external injury, or causes rather. I want to know how you guys are thinking about comorbidity. Like I'm thinking of traffic accidents due to DUIs from alcohol abuse. I'm thinking about suicide due to some sort of lethal diagnosis or fatal diagnosis that you got inside. You know what I mean? Like these things are not mutually exclusive. So I'm curious
Right.
about how you're treating them.
Yeah, I mean, currently we're
is being explanatory in and of itself. Each little variable.
Currently, we're just sort of using the primary cause of death as
Okay,
identified
like a
on.
top.
Yeah,
Got you.
and we could. I know Ingrid, our collaborator, has in the past sort of separated them out in different ways, and so maybe we should think about doing that, right? So you could look at all firearm deaths, for example, and that would cover a lot of the categories. I think Ingrid's done that in the past, so
Especially for
that's a
suicide.
good idea.
You know,
Yeah.
especially for suicide.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
I was wondering about the matching and whether you think that the deaths in prison are all matched. Was this easy to do? Was it hard to do?
Yeah. So we've written a paper about this, which is coming out in an epidemiology journal. It turns out during the time when people are in prison, the NDI data match very well with what the Department of Corrections thinks is happening to people, and that's sort of the best we can do. So the only thing we can compare to is what the Department of Corrections has, right? To sort of validate. But yeah. So during the time in prison, and the Department of Corrections doesn't pick up cause of death, not in any way we could easily extract for 145,000 people. So we can't validate the cause of death against anything else.
But you think, but basically you think that you're able to get people at high accuracy, and that this is not your difference between groups are not because of you're able to find the people in one group easier than the other.
No, that's a good question. I mean, we've done a lot of matching with these type of data to other data sources, and we've done pretty well across those. I mean, part of what because we've sampled initially from the Department of Corrections, we have everybody's aliases, we have everybody's multiple social security numbers that they've given various people at different points in time, whatever. And so we matched against all those things. We've basically used like the standard NDI definitions of what is a good match. I forget the NDI terminology. I can look it up. But there's no way to say for sure whether we're missing deaths, and that will explain differences though.
I just wonder what percentage could you find? I mean, because if they moved out of state, I mean, I know the ways of tracking, but I just wonder how many you could data on? Or
How many deaths are there?
No,
in
not
data?
deaths, but yeah, you wouldn't necessarily be able to find the people to get their data. I mean, if they moved out of state or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, the NDI follow people nationally, so we have some of the deaths
Yeah.
that we've matched or to people in other states. And it's you know, once you're sort of involved in the state criminal justice system, if you're on probation or you're on parole, for example, you can, if you really work at it, move out of state, but you're kind of trapped in Michigan. So, yeah, it's
So I have a question about the policy implications. How would your data speak to a policymaker who sort of read other possible implication? I mean, you said
put people in prison to make
you
them
said
healthier.
divert them from prison, right? Because obviously by imprisoning someone even once, you're increasing the risk that they might churn, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, what another implication is you just keep them in there as long as you can.
And keep them
They're all
alive.
good.
Yeah, so how would you respond?
$1,000 a year, or whatever it is.
I'm wondering how your data would speak to that question.
I don't know if there's anything in our data that could.
Well, I guess
They
you
could
could
speak to it,
communicate the risk of being imprisoned once as tantamount to the risk of churn, right? So, which would make your diversion point, but.
Right. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think the way if we were in front of a policy audience, the state legislature, I would cast things a little bit differently, right? Perhaps, but I mean, I really think it is as much a statement about prison as it is about access to health care and just sort of people's general well-being, whether in employment, like that, on the outside. So Ingrid presented this at the World Health Organization in Europe, and I mean, people from Europe were just like aghast by this. But they're in an environment with social welfare state, universal health insurance, and we're they don't see the same things, right? And they're just in a different world. They're in a world where any death in prison would be just like canary in a coal mine, kind of, like this prison not being run effectively, whereas we're different. It's unfortunately for how we evolve.
I guess kind of following that policy implication, I'm wondering how seriously you want to interpret the causality in the multiple incarcerations, like churning, because we might think that even conditioning on the observables, that people who are in prison multiple times during the period are like in very different environments than someone who's in prison 0 or 1 times.
Yes, yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's why we're going to try to do this natural experiment thing with the plan is to, we have, as we've done with other outcomes, like employment and recidivism, to essentially use the random assignment of judges as an instrument for incarceration. It's a little trickier here in this sort of time-varying context, and marrying that with event history or survival model is tricky too, so we've gotten there yet. That's where we're going.
Hi, thanks, Dave. I was wondering, because I find this idea of training very, very interesting, and I guess it's very central to kind of the story that you're telling. I was wondering, your duration in prison variable, was that over the entire course of your personal history, or is it per incarceration event? This is kind of the average time spent.
So it is set up as a time-varying variable starting from the start of study time. So the cumulative amount of time as of that, and we're conditioning on the amount of time you spent in prison prior to the start of the study. So prior to being selected in this 2003 to 2006 period. Because we haven't tried sort of just summing those two and looking at that specifically.
I was wondering if there's some kind of interaction between the time spent in prison. So this spells the time spent and the number of times you've been in prison. So kind of characterizing the back and forthness. So do you go there and you stay for a while and then leave, and then also the gap between your prison spells would be very interesting, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of
that is another thing we're starting to think about. Sort of like how long has it been since you were last in prison? That's sort of another variables
So,
here to
so
look
you've
at.
seen the data, so I'm wondering if you had any kind of summary insights about what the churning looks like.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I mean, so the typical amount of time in prison. So if you're put in prison for a new conviction, the median is somewhere around 2 years. Right. So we aren't talking about churning like in a matter of months. So you do see some people who come in for 6 months if they come in on a parole violation, but that's actually relatively rare too during this time period. Michigan is known for actually having a very long, relatively long time in prison. So yeah, it's not just sort of this quick churning. It's, you're in there for a year or two. So plenty of time for getting access to the prison health care, setting up care plans, getting on regular medication. Are we? All right, thank you.
We've already heard a little bit about Heather. And Heather Harris is going to present work with David Harding on health, the transition to adulthood, and prisoner reentries. And Heather is, get my notes here, Heather is the social science matrix postdoctoral scholar. I didn't know that was the official title. And as you can see by her co-author, she's working with David Harding, and she studies the health effects of incarceration and using very large administrative data. And welcome, Heather.
Information on smoking.
So thank you, Leora, and thank everybody for having me. Actually, I just want to make sure I understand how this works. Okay. So as Leora said, I'm working with Dave on this project, and actually I should acknowledge the Berkeley Population Center that gave us a small grant to look into this issue here. So this is therefore a little bit of an exploratory project, and so we're just in the beginning stages here. And with that preface, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction. So the transition to adulthood is a developmental stage in the life course. It's situated between adolescence and adulthood. And essentially, the framework that we're working with tries to explain how people move from adolescence into adulthood. So it's not really a theory. It's just sort of a set of ideas. And it focuses on how people meet markers of adulthood in 4 domains in particular. So education, employment, household formation, and then also family formation. And typically the transition age had been focused on sort of the late adolescence, late teens, and early 20s, but as the transition has dragged out over time, so has the age range expanded. And so most people are really into their early 30s before their transition has completed. Our idea here is that health is an underexplored domain in the transition to adulthood framework, and you can imagine why. Most young people, relative to other people, are very healthy. But what they also do relative to other age groups is engage in risky behaviors like substance abuse and violence, and those are threats to their health. They're threats to their longevity, in fact. And we see involvement in substance abuse and violence breaking down along racial lines, and we see this in the cause of death information from the Centers for Disease Control. So it's fairly stark among young black men, so 18 to 34. We see homicide as a leading cause of death, and among young white men, they're more likely to be involved in substance use, and overdoses are among the leading cause of death for young white men. This too is true in our sample, and I'll show you a quick slide on that a little later. So the idea here is we are observing these racial differences in health behaviors and outcomes, and we want to use a transition to adulthood framework in order to help explain them. And we want to integrate health into that framework. So what we're hoping is that there's going to be variation in the achievement of the markers of adulthood, specifically racial variation in those achievements that help us to explain what's going on with health. So based on the literature, we think that education in general should protect against substance abuse and violence, and that's because education in general is protective. Most people have better health outcomes the more educated they are. Employment, we too think, should protect against substance abuse and violence, but there is some evidence, particularly among adolescents and young people in general, of a positive link between delinquency and employment. We're also hypothesizing that neighborhood change could be good, so a sort of protective effect, whereas stability might be harmful in that people stay steeped in, their old ways and the same environments that caused their imprisonment. But the problem with that is that there's also some evidence from the Moving to Opportunity study that people move to criminal opportunities, right? So they have a comparative advantage of their new neighborhoods, and then they commit more delinquency. And in our sample in particular, marriage is really low, so there are very low rates of marriage, so we're looking at cohabitation as having a similar kind of protective effect. So as Leora said, our data are administrative data. This particular sample is just 18 to 25-year-old males who were released from Michigan prisons in 2003. And these are the data that we have collected on them. So the mortality, again, come from NDI, and as Dave said, there are deaths not in the NDI that are in MDOC data, and for this sample, there's few enough that I was able to code them. So we also have substance abuse testing and treatment data, arrest and incarceration histories, education data, and that's coming from both, or from DOC, from the GED testing service itself, and from the National Student Clearinghouse on college enrollments. We have employment data, residences that were coded from parole, and then we have this sort of rich set of neighborhood and county characteristics that I'm having trouble integrating into the analysis, and so I'll talk about that as part of the challenges later, but they're coming from these multiple sources. These are not all of the covariates in the model, but they give you an idea of what our sample looks like. So in Michigan, it really does break down into black and white. There are very few other races in prison, so that's what our sample looks like. As you can see, they're a little bit on the older side of the transition to adulthood, so 22, 23. And there are racial differences at baseline in terms of education, employment, criminal history. And I just want to draw your attention over here to the gray highlighted. Those are the different kinds of residential situations that people can be in, and we see at baseline that whites are more likely to be living with their parents, blacks with older relatives. And this is just to show you that what was true in the overall population is certainly true in our sample. So we have 52 deaths. Blacks are dying from homicide, and all but 3 of those are gun homicides. And then there's a little bit more variation in whites, but still we see that overdoses are the leading cause of death in our sample, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about what kinds of drugs people are using in a minute. So after I get through with a little bit more motivation, the models that I'm going to present to you are discrete time event history models, and they're quarterly because the unemployment insurance data are reported quarterly. And what these allow is for us to incorporate time-varying information that allows us to look at how things like employment, residential shifts, and college enrollments are affecting the substance abuse outcomes that we're going to look at. We can also account for competing risks, so parole discharge, time in custody, and death. And we're doing that in multinomial quotient models. So we can look at all of these different outcomes, but I of course don't have time to do that today. So we're just going to look at the substance abuse outcomes, and in particular testing and residential treatment. And so you can see that there is a difference in terms of the competing risks, because you can be substance abuse tested while you're in prison, and we do know about that. So just to sort of recap and reorient everyone, this is the puzzle that we're trying to solve. So can this transition to adulthood framework be used to explain racial differences in health outcomes? So we're specifically looking at racial differences in substance abuse, and I'm going to show you those in a minute, just looking at Fisher exact tests. And we're looking at, as measured by substance abuse testing and treatment, and then we want to look at how that's responding to college enrollments, employment, returning to the same neighborhood after prison, and living with a romantic partner. That's supposed to appear. So we should see some differences, hopefully, in substance abuse that we want to explain. And in terms of daily drug use, we actually don't see any. So this is any drugs or alcohol. About 1/3 of both blacks and whites are using them daily. And I should say that in all of these, I'm going to present a whole bunch of these, and all of these, the blacks are on the left, the whites are on the right. And the yellow is what you shouldn't be looking at. So in terms of drug testing, almost everybody is testing. Almost everybody is tested, but where there is sort of a an advantage in terms of not being surveilled. Whites have it. Among the tested, blacks are actually more likely to test positive, so about 2/3 test positive, whereas about half of whites do, and that's just among the tested. And also, by 2009, about 1/3 of white parolees, or a little bit more than 1/3 of white parolees had been to prison, or had been to residential treatment, and about 1/4 of blacks had been to residential treatment. So we see actually like high residential treatment rates, but more whites are going. So this presents a little bit deeper of a puzzle. So whites are more likely to die as a result of drug use, but blacks and whites are each using drugs daily. And blacks are more likely to be tested and test positive, but whites are more likely to go to treatment. So what we want to see is some variation, some racial variation in transitional markers that might explain these different outcomes. So in terms of employment, pre-prison, whites are more likely to be employed, and that's true post-prison. Admittedly, these are low employment rates, but they favor whites. Whites are also more likely than blacks to return to the same neighborhood after prison. So this is just looking at the immediately after prison address. So slightly more than 1/3 of whites and slightly fewer than 1/3 of blacks return to the same address. Blacks are more likely than whites to continue their education. So in terms of college enrollments, blacks are about 1/4 of blacks enrolled in college, whereas only about 20% of whites do. And finally, blacks are also more likely than whites to cohabitate immediately after prison. So again, these cohabitation rates are low relative to other living situations, but if we were going to see some protective effects, we would hope to see it amongst blacks. So this is sort of an admittedly facile way of thinking about it, but this is where we are right now. If you just look at the education among black parolees, what we want to see is that there's a protective effect in terms of substance abuse, and we're expecting the effect for blacks to be greater than for whites because there are higher prevalences of blacks enrolling in college. So, and this is how we're sort of deciding to think about it for all of the different variables. But there is also another story that we can tell here, right? So it might really be about the types of drugs that people are using. And I feel like this is something that we need to account for. So the only type of drugs that blacks are using at higher prevalences is marijuana. All of the other drugs whites are using at higher prevalences, including alcohol. Okay, so these are our event history models, and I'll describe the table to you first because the second table is going to look similar. So this is substance abuse testing. We have here the different risks, so the risk of testing positive and the risk of not being tested, and that's relative to having a negative test. The blue highlighted variables are the ones that I'm going to interpret for you because those are related to the transitional markers. So with respect to the same pre and post tract, what we see here is that there is a positive effect on substance abuse, positive substance abuse tests as a result of returning to the same neighborhood. And so that's what we expected. And we see that it's stronger for whites, which is something that we also expected because more whites return to the same neighborhood. In terms of employment, we see something sort of mixed here. So we do see this overall negative effect, but it's actually stronger for blacks than it is for whites, whereas we were sort of expecting it to be stronger for whites. So it might suggest some selection here.
Does a star mean different from 0? Does it mean different from?
It means different from the negative test. Oh, I guess I should, yes, that's a good question, thank you. So this is a model that includes everybody and then runs separately for blacks and separately for whites. And I'm not comparing the coefficients at all. I'm just looking at
The value.
levels, yeah, values. But that is something that we can do. So in terms of college enrollments, we don't see any effects on positive tests, but what we do see is a reduction in your probability of being tested, which is suggesting something positive potentially about what the criminal justice system is doing, and that is giving you a pass for being enrolled. And we don't see anything here in terms of whether or not you're living with a romantic partner relative to your parents. What we do see, however, is, something that we expect. So marijuana stays in your system longer, so you're just more likely to have a positive test if that's your drug of choice. It stays in your system about twice as long as the next most lengthy drug. But what's strange here is that we see that effect looks a little stronger amongst whites as opposed to blacks. The other thing I want to point out here, so I'm not really interpreting anything in the risk of not being tested, except for the fact that none of the prior information that the criminal justice system could leverage in order to decide who to test appears to be being leveraged. So nothing about whether or not you have a prior positive substance abuse test, a prior drug arrest, or even really daily use. It seems to be factored into those decisions. So these are the residential substance abuse treatment outcomes. The tables are set up the same. The baseline outcome here is not going to treatment, or not being in treatment. So what we see here is, again, a positive overall effect of being in the same neighborhood. So you return to the same neighborhood, you're more likely to end up in treatment. But we don't see any, it doesn't look like there's any racial differentiation. In terms of employment, we see the negative effect. It's essentially this mirroring what we saw in testing. And in terms of college enrollments, we're not seeing anything here in terms of going to treatment. But we do see a little bit of a protective effect amongst whites of living with a romantic partner relative to your parents. Finally, here, again, we see that this drug of choice probably matters. So alcohol, cocaine, heroin, if you're using those things, you're more likely to end up in residential treatment. And this is strongest among whites, who are, of course, the ones using those drugs. So I'm going to give you a little conclusions, and then I'll talk about some future directions that we want to take this. So this is just recapping. And like what we're seeing here is that there might be some promise for using this framework in order to explain health outcomes and then to integrate health into the framework more broadly. So enrolling in college reduces the probability of being tested only for blacks. Unfortunately, other outcomes aren't affected. Employment also reduces positive substance abuse tests and the probability of being tested for all parolees. But where we expected the effect to be stronger for whites, we're seeing it stronger for blacks. Returning to the same neighborhood increases the probability of testing positive and of entering treatment for all parolees, but whites are more likely to test positive, but they aren't more likely to enter treatment, so we did not. Cohabitating reduces the probability of entering treatment only for white parolees, but it does not for blacks. And then we see that this sort of like racially divergent drug preference is also playing a role, and this is something that potentially we can interrogate. So future directions. So our idea here, so right now the event history models are a little bit limiting because they truncate our data where the residences end, and that's in 2009. If we look at developmental trajectories, it'll allow us to incorporate more of the data that we have. So we can look pre, during, and post-prison at the different metrics, and our idea here is to model each domain separately to see if we can get at how movement into one transitional marker affects movements into later markers. What you can do with group trajectory modeling is so let's model into the first transitional marker, and then the group membership probabilities that you get are essentially propensity scores that you can use to predict later outcomes in other trajectories. So that's the idea. The challenges to doing this are, so we've got a few. Right now, because we only have 1,300 people, there are quite a few counties that only have 1 or 2 parolees in them. And so, I've been trying to get different kinds of models to run. So we're using county fixed effects, obviously wasn't working. I've got these structural equation models which allow me to cluster on 2 variables, but they've been running for weeks, and I'm not 100%. I'm not sure that that's going to work out. But what we really wanted to get at here is a means of testing, some of the ecological hypotheses. So just the relative deprivation of black and white neighborhoods, does that lead to increases in violence specifically? So part of that is going to be better articulating the reasons for the racial differences than I'm currently doing in this presentation, and also maybe refining our definitions of transitional markers. So we have a larger project that's working to do this, and we're mostly focusing on stability, but it would probably be a little bit better if we were also integrating some independence in that as well. So not just looking at whether you live with your parents for 4 quarters, but maybe do you live in your own household for 4 quarters? Do you live with a partner for 4 quarters? So, thank you.
Time for questions?
Hi, Erin.
Where's gender and parenthood in this?
So it's not in this. So in terms of gender, this is only young males, and that's because in the sample there are only 63 women, and so it just doesn't make sense to include them in this kind of analysis. We're looking at them separately. And in terms of the dependence, we don't actually have really great data on that. It's a data problem, basically. So what we can look at is, did you sort of ever indicate that you have a dependent? But getting beyond that, so it's...
That's a huge transition to adulthood, I would just imagine.
Yeah, no,
just
well,
wondering.
exactly, and it looks like a lot of these people are parents
I would
before they
bet.
come in. Yeah,
I would bet.
exactly. No, I would too.
Thank you.
Oh, hi. So I was wondering about how the distribution of the availability of residential treatment might play in.
So actually, almost every county has at least one facility. I think that there's one county that doesn't.
So you don't think that that's biasing the results? It's actually.
So I think I have one more slide. So in terms of this particular sample, it looks like the criminal justice, I'm looking at this bottom bullet point, the criminal justice system is actually equalizing and then more access to residential treatment. So if we look at it in 2003, less than 1% of similarly aged people ended up in residential treatment, whereas 4% of the whites and 2% of the blacks in our sample were actually released into residential treatment. And then over time, they're just getting it at very high prevalences, but the problem is quality. And I don't know if it's higher or lower, but we do know where people get treatment.
But the racial differences you don't think are explained by some difference in availability for blacks and whites. We don't know it explains it, but we don't think that's.
I can look at it, but yeah, I don't think it is. Yeah.
I'm thinking that the white prison population is probably more highly adversely selected relative to the general white population than is true for the black prison population. And I'm wondering if that is a useful thought in terms of interpreting some of this, in particular the college enrollment, or continuing education after getting out of prison for blacks being higher than whites and so on, or whether that might be helpful in terms of thinking of research design, although I don't really see exactly how.
It might. So we see some indication, there's a graduate student working on education, and so we do see some indication that kind of continuity in education might be affecting whether or not people are enrolling. So blacks are less likely to have a high school degree, or they're about as likely to have a high school degree, but they're less likely to have their GED. So that means they're when they come out of prison. So that means that they're working on it. Whereas the whites might just get it quicker, and then there's a break off, and then why go back? That kind of thing. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly what you're thinking in terms of.
Well, I'm thinking that, for example, if you looked at various characteristics, including educational attainment of whites in the prison system versus the white population in general, they would look relatively worse than the black population, if you looked at education,
Sure.
say relative to the black population in general in that age group. And in that sense, so that would be an observable characteristic, but you might think that they would also be more negatively selected relative to the general population on unobservable characteristics.
Right.
And that would be a bigger problem
Right.
for interpretation and analysis.
Potentially. I'll take it under advisement.
Anyone else? Okay, well, we get a break. Okay, so our next speaker is Professor Sandra Smith, who's an associate professor in sociology. She's primarily a qualitative researcher with a long-standing interest in questions of urban poverty, joblessness, social capital, social networks, racial inequality, and interracial dynamics and trust. But in this work, you're going to see a strong quantitative side, and that is, I believe, the contribution of Nora. Broege? That's right. Okay. I don't know. Sure. And who's also, by the way, a consultant in D-Lab, and so if you want some help, you can talk to her there. Anyhow, so Sandra's going to speak about searching for work with a criminal record.
So I want to thank Leora and the Berkeley Population Center for the invitation to present on this work. Pretty excited to be here, although I've not been able to attend for much of the day and have to leave soon after my own presentation in order to finish up office hours for the semester. As you can understand, end of semester chaos. But I'm hoping that you could share with me, Amy, because I'm going to miss your informal discussion, your comments later. And Erin, I'm hoping we can have coffee in the new year where you can tell me about your own research. I'd be excited to hear about that. So, it is by now well known that contact with the penal system is associated with worse employment outcomes in the short and the long term. Arrest, conviction, and incarceration are associated with reduced odds of getting a job, and once employed, reduced numbers of weeks worked and wages earned annually. As explanation, some point to the marked job seekers' pre-offense individual level attributes, since characteristics that predict criminal behavior also help to explain employment outcomes post-offense. Others locate post-offense employment disadvantage and a loss of valuable human capital and social capital, which erodes with incarceration. Most researchers, however, highlight the role that legal and social stigmas play in erecting institutional barriers to legitimate work in the formal economy. Specifically, they point to state and federal restrictions on government access to government employment and government-regulated private industry. They point to employers' fears that they will be found liable for negligent hiring if marked employees act criminally on the job, but most especially, they point to employers' distrust of a pool of job candidates who essentially have been certified untrustworthy by the criminal justice system. Institutional exclusion then is argued to be a primary mechanism through which employment prospects of justice-involved people are significantly diminished. So the dominant narrative, though, I think, is the one related to employer discrimination and what this means in terms of engagement in the labor force. So criminal justice involvement leads to employer discrimination, which leads to unemployment among the justice involved. And there are, I think, two dominant assumptions that are made with this argument that I want to interrogate a bit further in this research. And the first is that the justice involved are still searching for work in the formal wage economy, right? So you think about Deeper Page's work, you're not thinking about the person who's outside of the labor market hoping for the job offers to come in. You're imagining the person putting in lots of applications, and for some applicants, those who have a criminal record, they have to put in a lot more applications before they get a hit, right? So we're imagining actively engaged labor market participants. And that, I think, also embedded in this, but never clearly stated, is that the ways in which one searched before they had criminal justice contact is the way that they search afterwards. So my behavior doesn't change as a result of criminal justice contact, right? It continues, but because of that status, I'm now being treated differently by the market itself, right? So there's nothing about my behavior around search that should change. But my interviews with, I've been doing qualitative research, as Leo pointed out, focusing primarily on low-income Black men and women and their relationship to the labor market, and usually from a social capital, social network lens. And so when I've talked to people about their experiences, many of these men and women have had criminal justice contact. And when I talk to them about their labor market experiences, how it is that they're searching for work, what I find is that there's actually a lot of change that happens as a result of criminal justice contact in terms of the way in which they engage or search for work. So of course I do get the folks who go out, they're searching hard, they are putting in so many applications and they get no hits, and it's incredibly frustrating, right? So their unemployment does seem to be due, at least in part, to criminal justice contact. But I've also interviewed men, and to a lesser extent women, who talk about how as a result of criminal justice contact, they no longer rely on friends and family members to search for work because the stigma associated with the criminal record makes them uncomfortable to do so, right? Many feel like they have to, among these folks who have this issue, feel like they have to prove themselves. I need to show that I'm worthy of the assistance that I hopefully will get at some point, but don't want to seek at this point. And some actually talk about how, having tried that in the past, they felt like they were set up for, they were actually going to be exploited by folks in the networks because they are in a precarious situation. Folks are like, well, why don't you pay me? You pay me, I will help you. And in light of that, they're unwilling also to engage. And so there's this backing away of networks during a period in their job search where it probably would be really helpful to have networks help you, especially given the stigma associated with the criminal record. So from my in-depth interviews with folks who are engaging this process, contact leads to a shift in how they engage with the job search process for a whole host of reasons related to criminal justice contact. But this doesn't really come up very much in the literature as we see it, right? So there are two assumptions that we should problematize. Apparently I've gone through that, so I don't need that anymore. But despite, actually I'll go ahead and read this. But despite decades of research on the labor market experiences of justice involvement, mostly men, we know relatively little about whether and how contact alters job search, whether or not they search for work, and if they do search, whether or not their search patterns have changed in ways that might affect their likelihood of finding work. This is a curious omission in part because substantial demand-side employment barriers have clear implications for how people engage in job search and job success. The justice involved would have to search with much greater intensity and effort to find work relative to equally qualified uninvolved counterparts. And this is a point about which many of the justice involved know. They know that they have to work extra hard in order to be able to get the kinds of outcomes that they're looking for. So this caused me to look into the body of research on this topic and came across an article by one of the few, actually, Appel and Sweeten, who used an NLSY 97, and they are investigating the factors that lay behind incarceration's apparent effect on employment outcomes, contrasting the experiences of convicted youth who had been incarcerated with convicted youth who had not. They showed that formerly incarcerated youths were less likely to be employed, in good part because they were less likely than non-incarcerated counterparts to be labor force participants. Driven, it seems, by labor market detachment, proportionately fewer search for work. So they weren't in the labor market at all. Part of the gap that existed between those who were employed and those who weren't were that those who were not employed were not in the labor market looking for work. And so they argue that this is in good part helping to make sense of some of the gap that exists. Here again, we're implicating job search in this process. So we, Nora and I, are going beyond Appel and Sweeten in two ways as I see it. From the one way is that we investigate, and I'm going to go into this a little bit more, whether and how penal contact affects individuals' odds of searching for work, as well as how they search for work. So Appel and Sweeten focus primarily on search or not, right? Are you engaged in the labor market or are you out of the labor market? We're also looking at, among those who are in the labor market, what kind of search strategies do they deploy? We're also interested in looking at different penal dispositions. Appel appellants, we primarily focus on those who've been incarcerated, but we know from prior research that any kind of contact with the criminal justice system can upset your likelihood of finding work, right? Arrest, conviction, and incarceration have an effect. So we're interested in how, for each of these groups, job search may have an impact on their ability to, may be affected, or it may affect how they search and thus have an effect on their search success. From the job seeker's perspective, and then now we're thinking in terms of job search and why it is that people search the way they do or don't. The benefits of search are twofold. One, it's a primary means through which you gain information about job vacancies and job offer packages, and it communicates to employers that you're available, right? So key to economic theories of job search is the notion that search is not a costless pursuit. It takes time, often requires money, and frequently involves a whole bunch of opportunity costs, both present and future. So job seekers are essentially theorized to end their searches and accept offers at some optimal stopping point, which is when employers extend offers, blah, blah, blah. You get them. So why wouldn't the justice-involved search for work? We identify in this paper 3 reasons why they wouldn't search for work. The first is related to the quantity and quality of jobs that are available to folks who are marked in the way that they are. Many of the justice involved may be unwilling to search at all, much less with greater intensity, effort, and persistence needed to find work, especially with their mark, if there are too few job opportunities available of sufficient quality. Not only have federal and state governments restricted access to employment opportunities, they've also enacted numerous provisions against extending licenses to justice-involved people for government-related private occupations, and the result has been devastating. For instance, nationwide, roughly 800 different occupations are completely off-limits to those who, to ex-felons. And in Florida, 40% of jobs in large employment sectors have been revealed to be off-limits, again, to those who have this mark. But not only is it an issue of the quantity of jobs, it's an issue of job quality available to these folks. It's generally poor. For instance, according to Vischer and Kachnowski, of the minority of former prisoners from Illinois employed within 8 months of release, the overwhelming majority worked in construction, manual labor, and maintenance, among the few industries still generally open to hiring these folks, and they earned between $750 and $900 a month, right? Even in Illinois, and maybe if this is Chicago, but you get the point. Okay, so thus, after penal contact, these job seekers are essentially compelled to expend much more effort to search for and find many fewer jobs with positions of questionable quality. In this context, choosing not to search for work or reducing the effort that it takes to find a job actually kind of makes sense from a particular perspective. Indeed, such perceptions have been found in previous research to be associated with reduced search effort and withdrawal from search entirely. And then there's the question of before search options. Prior research often links, especially economic research often links financial stress to search. I need money, I have to pay my bills, I'm going to get out there and find a job, right? It could be the case that your financial stress that was so overwhelming that it reduces your willingness to find work, right? Financial stress associated with criminal justice contact may actually be that kind of demotivator, and it can discourage labor force participation altogether. Not often discussed is whether or not, or to what extent, new work arrangements enable job seekers to adjust the financial burdens they face. It is not just that the jobs that are available to justice-involved men pay low wages, it's also that many face these crushing debts associated with criminal justice contact, including child support. Many simply can't afford to fulfill these obligations in the short term, and given the accumulation of interest over the long term, it's just unlikely that they can pay these things off. So now you imagine putting a lien on their wages weekly, the $750 to $900 becomes equivalent of like $300 or $50 a month, especially if you have a child. There's no point in working if that's your situation, right? So there are certain kinds of interventions that actually make it less likely, I think, for people to be willing to engage in job search altogether. For legal fines and fees, states can extract as much as 35%, for wages as much as 65% for child support, for bad child support, and such reductions from already meager earnings make it impossible to meet other needs and obligations. Importantly, Harris and her colleagues found that about 80% of their respondents found these financial obligations to be so overwhelming that they found them unduly burdensome, and this heightened financial stress actually had the unintended consequence of reducing their commitment to work, right? So exactly what we're imagining would happen in this situation. And there's been quite a bit of research on child care that shows the same effect. So despite the possibility of jail time even, for non-payment, some of her respondents chose not to work, or their respondents, relying on crime or where available cash assistance to make ends meet. And then there's the issue of opportunities to search. And just to be very quick about this, since I'm sure I'm running out of time, criminal justice contact can reduce the opportunities to search to the extent that you might be held in pre-trial detention. That's an obvious one. But it's also the case that a series of procedural hassles from courts, you have to continue to go to court, several times over the course of a year, can eat up not just the time it takes, but your willingness to find a job because you're not quite sure what the outcome of your case is going to be. So why invest in those kinds of that kind of search? And then the burdensome tasks that are associated with performing for the court can also make it unlikely that people will engage in search. Although most of these obligations would not likely prevent arrestees, convicts, or former prisoners from searching for work, especially since for many, job search is a condition of probation and parole. They represent competing demands and possibly demands a greater priority. So then, final point, one of the points, we would expect them to search differently to the extent, after criminal justice contact, to the extent that stigma might lead folks to rely less on their networks. The shame associated with having contact might make it so that people will be unlikely or less likely to rely on networks, and even to apply directly to employers, knowing that folks will look at them in a certain way because they have criminal justice contact. But it might increase the likelihood that they engage in passive search much more than they would before, because passive search doesn't require much. You're not going to an employer, you're not looking anyone in the face, you're not experiencing the stigma that you would otherwise experience. But as some of my respondents from my previous work indicate, it makes them feel agentic. They're doing something. They're engaged in search, but it's not the kind of search that puts their own pride on the line, right? So it will likely increase passive search, but decrease searching through networks and directly applying to employers. Greater access to institutional support. We know that as it's been more difficult for people with a criminal record to find jobs, the state has invested lots of resources on building up labor market institutions that effectively try to kind of provide a kind of a channel through which those who've had criminal justice contact can find work. And so we've seen a tremendous growth in temporary employment agencies focused on the issues related to the justice involved. And so we might see, because of greater access to these institutions, greater reliance on them as well with criminal justice contact. And then I imagine that race and ethnicity matter to the extent that in each of these areas, the quality and quantity of jobs available, nature of before search options, and opportunities to search, each of those will affect racial and ethnic groups differently. I would go into that in greater detail, but because I'm running out of time, I'm going to move forward and we can discuss in the Q&A. So falling back on these two questions, does penal contact and do different dispositional categories affect individuals' engagement in job search, whether or not they search and how they engage in the process, and what effect does this search engagement shaped by penal contact have on search success? So, and just kind of pit these two perspectives together in ways that maybe is probably a bit unnecessary, but allows for some measure of tension. There's the unemployment story. It's kind of the diva pager. These institutional barriers make it so that folks search but can't find work, and so they're unemployed. Or the labor market detachment story, which is much more the Pell and Sweeten argument. Folks who just aren't engaged in searching for work, and that helps us to make sense of it. What's going on, unemployment or detachment? So, like Appel and Sweeten, we rely on NLSY. I'm going to go through this very quickly. We did a lot of things that they did and some that they didn't. If you want more details on this, get a copy of the paper. primarily interested in job search, whether or not they searched, the content of the search, how did they search for work, search scope, how many methods did they use in order to find jobs. It's our way of trying to get at the question of intensity and search success. Did their search episode end in a job, a new job? The predictive variables, penal contact, importantly, we would expect major differences between those who've had no contact and those who had some contact. We primarily focus on the differences between those who are pre-contact. So I am someone who eventually will have contact with the criminal justice system. We're comparing the pre-contact search patterns with the post-contact search patterns, right? So after I had contact, do I look the same or am I acting differently? Penal disposition, arrest, conviction, incarceration, and race and ethnicity, a whole set of controls that we should have paid attention to. Methods, we attempt to address non-random selection into search, both by controlling for all relevant variables we can imagine and that we had, and also by running hybrid fixed effects models to control for time invariant unreservables. This essentially allows us to use, rely on the what's best about fixed effects analysis, but also random effects analysis. We added statistical weights to account for selection into search, multiple imputation to address missing data issues, and we ran our analyses separately by race and ethnicity. Okay, so now to get into the data. I probably have like 2 minutes left, right?
Huh? You can have 5 or 6.
Okay, so search patterns pre and post contact. Again, one of the assumptions I think embedded in the body of research that exists is that there's not much of a shift that happens in how people search after they have contact with the criminal justice system. I want to start down here and then head up. So these are folks who searched pre and post, and it's by their disposition, right? So blue represents all of those who've had contact, red represents those who've been arrested, orange is those who've been convicted but not incarcerated, and brown is those who have been convicted and incarcerated. Okay, so what do we see? What we see here essentially is that 50%, and this is a male sample, we drew primarily, we only drew males, 50% at best searched both before and after criminal justice contact, right? If we were thinking in terms of the diva page-alike argument, we would imagine this number would have been far greater, right? A good percentage of folks aren't engaging on both ends of the criminal justice contact. For those who searched pre, and of course the levels differ based on disposition, so those who've been incarcerated, just 1/5 of those who had been incarcerated actually had any evidence of search before they had criminal justice contact or after, right? Among those who searched pre but not post, so they had criminal justice contact, and maybe they thought, you know what, this just there's no way I'm going to get a job now. Who knows exactly what happens here? But among those who've been incarcerated, 40% had searched before contact, and then after contact, there was no evidence of search. 32% of those who've been incarcerated, but not who have been convicted but not incarcerated, and 25% of those who had been arrested showed evidence of search beforehand, but not after they had contact. Those who searched post but not pre, so they weren't searching before, then they have criminal justice contact, and then they say, oh crap, I need to get my life together, let me go try to find a job. 22%, almost 1/5 of those who've been incarcerated had that, and more than the other groups. And then there's the kind of small minority, but still significant, of those who neither searched before or after criminal justice contact, right? Here we see almost 1/5 of those who've been incarcerated had not searched in either period, right? No evidence of search at all. So this suggests that there's quite a bit of movement between before and after contact, or after contact happens with criminal justice. Are justice involved young men less likely to search for work after having contact with the criminal justice system? This is based on our hybrid logistic regressions and the effects of penal contact on search with controls. Here again, this is what we'd expect, right? Those people who don't have any contact with the criminal justice system look very different from those who do, and this is much more likely to have searched. But those who have had contact relative to their pre-contact selves, right? So this is me who's had contact, and I'm relating that to the time before I actually had contact. What was my search like then, and what was my search like afterwards? After I've had contact, I'm less likely to search for work, and that's across racial and ethnic categories, right? If we break it down by disposition, more bars, but the story is the same. Whether you're arrested, and so that I think that's actually pretty important. We tend to focus on incarceration, where the effects tend to be larger, or even those who've been convicted, where again the results tend to be the size of the effects are larger. But even among those who've been arrested, having that arrest, even without the conviction, produces a lower odds of searching after having that contact. Not surprisingly, those who've had no contact do search. Do they search using fewer methods? This is our way again of tapping into how much intensity or effort they put into the process of finding work. Again, those who've not had any contact are very different. Those who have had contact, post-contact, you're less likely to use an additional method of search than your pre-contact self. So they are using fewer methods, it seems, to find work after contact. And again, if we break it down by disposition, the general pattern remains. There's some instances where it's not significant, but we still see among those who've been arrested, convicted, and incarcerated, with the exception of Black former prisoners, that the odds of using an additional method to search is reduced relative to their pre-contact selves. Are they searching differently? I mean, that they're using fewer methods suggests that something different is happening in terms of content, right? And here we're looking at whether or not they've searched through the networks, labor market intermediation, actively going alone, and passive search. Again, based on my own interviews, I would have expected there to be folks to be relying on their networks a little bit less, maybe relying on labor market intermediation more because there's great access to these kinds of resources. Actively going alone, I actually would have expected them to be doing that less, again, because of the stigma. And passive search, well, it's a way of searching without really putting yourself on the line. So what do we find? In terms of network search, basically kind of across the board here again, we find that post-contact, there's a reduction in one's use of networks relative to pre-contact self. That is, again, across the board with a couple of exceptions. The general pattern, though, is, I think, very clear. If we look at labor market intermediation, people, generally speaking, are, but especially those who've been convicted but not incarcerated, and those who've been convicted and incarcerated. Here we see, and this is where we expect to see the increase, right? Because the kinds of programs that have been made available are programs that are specifically made available for those folks. They're not made available to the folks who've been arrested but not convicted, right? So we wouldn't expect to see movement there in the direction that we would for conviction and incarceration. So I was actually kind of happy to see that. Well, you know, okay. And then active search. Here, it's kind of all over the place, but there is a pattern that I want to point out. In terms of incarceration, across the board, it doesn't matter which group we're looking at, they're less likely to actively search than their pre-contact selves. In the case of conviction, two of the three groups are less likely to, although that's not significant in the case of whites. Latinos are more likely to. One of the things I have to do is figure out why we have such variation. Those who've been arrested, I think, are more likely than the other two groups to actively search. Black and white respondents who have been arrested show evidence of more active engagement relative to their contact self, there you go. And passive, this too is what I generally would have expected, right? Increased engagement in passive search allows you to feel like you're engaged in the process without putting yourself on the line in the way that folks do, and then getting rejected because of the stigma associated with a criminal record. We see almost across the board increases in the odds of passively searching for work after having criminal contact and relative to the pre-contact selves. So do these differences in job search help to explain men's gap in job search success? I think to some extent, I mean, it's not like, you know, it's not answering the problem of lack of employment, but it does explain some of the gap. So the blue represents the model with controls only. With the red, we add the scope measure, and with the orange, we take out scope and put in search contact. We couldn't include both because of issues of collinearity. And so what we do find is that with each of these measures, we explain some measure of the gap between, as resulting from searching with fewer methods, and also resulting from the type of methods that they use. And so what we, sorry, I need my notes to help me give you the exact figures. Search scope helps to explain between 8 and 10% of the gap in search success between pre and post contact job seekers. And the inclusion of search contact measures reduces the effect of penal contact on search success by 45% for the full sample, and by 20 to 20% for whites, blacks, and Latinos. Although I don't show it here, because that would be really overwhelming. The search scope helps to explain the gap in search success, specifically among arrestees, which explains 13 to 17% of the gap between pre-contact and arrestee job seekers. And finally, search contact helped to explain differences in search success for black convicts. It basically wipes out the effect entirely for Latino arrestees and for former prisoners and white arrestees. So it does help to explain some measure of the gap. So is it detachment or is it unemployment? This is a detachment story. Justice involvement does reduce the odds of searching for work across these dispositional categories. So there's a truth to Appellant Sweeten's argument. Future research, though, I think should look at the level, local and state level restrictions on employment for the justice involved perceptions of the quantity and quality of opportunities available to them, and the effect of having legal financial obligations, and also the amount of those obligations on search. But this is also an unemployment story. In general, justice involvement also negatively affects how individuals search for work, which has some effect on search success. So for future research, I think that what we should investigate to what extent and how penal contact affects individuals' opportunities, as well to search, as well as how they search, and for whom does stigma of justice involvement matter in terms of how they search for work. There you go. How much time did I take that back? So I'll take questions before I have to run to office hours.
Thank you very much. That was amazing. Just at the rate at which you speak as well. So, and it's still being very clear. First, 2 questions. If you could give an example of what a passive search looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, in your model, did you control for informal sources of income?
Oh, okay. In our model, we did not control for informal sources of income. And in terms of passive search strategies, it's like looking in a newspaper to see what kinds of opportunities exist, but not really doing anything about what you see. And in some cases, it's like, I don't know who does this anymore. I'm assuming that this is something we did like a generation and a half ago, but you post that you're looking for a job, which feels a bit more active, but I don't think anyone's doing that. I think what they're doing is largely looking at ads and noting what opportunities exist, but not really acting on them. So it's a kind of passive engagement in the process.
And just to follow up, is that something that's monitored, right? So people that are being released from prison, I mean, do you have to report, yes, I'm searching for work?
If you are on probation or parole, usually it's a condition of your probation or parole that you look for work if you don't have a job, right? But otherwise, I don't know who would be monitoring that kind of behavior. And in the case of those who are on probation or parole, my interviews indicate that folks are expected to kind of give a list of the employers that they stopped by and chatted with and have them sign off on it and those kinds of things. So I think it's monitored in the context of being under supervision, but not otherwise. I don't know you get much purchase though saying I looked at the internet or the newspapers. What did you say? Yeah, right. That's right. That's a good one. So thank you.
So in your talk, you kind of go through the sort of structural potential explanations for not searching for work that we're familiar with, economic opportunity. But then there are the cultural ones too, which can be on the employer's end, the perception of stigma and discrimination. What's interesting, of course, about your work is you're sort of inverting that to say, well, what about the internalization of this stigma? How does one sort of go about their stigma, right? Or
Yeah.
and what you describe is kind of sounds like this almost like humiliation ritual effect of sort of the interactional experience of seeing a limit in opportunities, the idea of your can't, even if you made enough money, your wages would be garnished because of the monetary sanctions and all of that. And what I'm wondering is based on some of the divergent findings across where the Black and Latino populations would go in one direction and the whites would go in another. If you guys are thinking about like relative falls in standing, could it be that the kind of white cohort of people both internalize their stigma differently to a greater extent, and is there a greater fall? Like, were they more advantaged to begin with and experience themselves as having a greater gap?
Were whites more, which group, what's the reference group here?
Well, so an example was that in terms of activating social networks, that there was one slide that you showed where the Latino and Black cohorts were more likely to activate their networks after, but whites were much less likely.
Were to activate the networks after.
Yeah. Yeah, network there, yeah.
Yeah.
So the way I read that is that, upon arrest and upon incarceration, in both cases, whites are less likely to go to their social networks, but
then their pre-contact selves,
right, but Latinos would be more likely after an arrest, and Blacks after. So
the figure for Blacks isn't significant, so we can't really make much of that.
Okay.
With Latinos, I think that it's a good question, what's happening with Latinos. We know in general Latinos are more likely to use their networks to find work. I'm not sure why there would be an ever-increasing likelihood of using networks in this situation, so it is something that we have to sort through.
Well, I guess I'm wondering, it's like, so if we know that there's sort of disproportionate criminal justice contact across different racial groups, could it be that this ritual of humiliation or the like severity of the stigma has something to do with how rare you are for having had contact? And that in some places you will be that much rarer if you are a white person.
Right.
And it moves along the line. Like you will be very rare as a white person who's been incarcerated. And whether the actual kind of quantitative fall in standing from your ability to find work before and after changes, if we could measure that. What's interesting about, I think what you're getting at is the internalized understanding of your stigma and your humiliation, sort of, or maybe whites feel more stigmatized.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are really good questions, and I think we should examine it further. I mean, I would want to rely on previous research to know to what extent. So like I know for sure that Blacks and Latinos who are arrested and incarcerated are coming from very specific neighborhoods where lots of other people are arrested and incarcerated. To what extent is that the case for whites? Are whites living in neighborhoods where, are whites who get arrested also living in neighborhoods where they're more, they're more likely to be arrested, and so they're not necessarily an anomaly, right? And that's the case. So I don't know, but that's something I think we should pay attention to. So it might be the case that I would imagine that the stigma, to the extent that they experience it less, would be among those who are embedded in communities where incarceration is less likely to happen. I'm not sure that all whites who get arrested have that experience. I suspect they're also going to trailer parks or wherever it is that they get arrested from to, I think they're also being routed from particular communities as well. But there's a subset, white collar folks who you don't expect to get arrested, who I think would feel the stigma, and you actually see that playing out in terms of their wages once they get out. They experience the greatest wages, and some people argue it's because, you're a white person who got, well, we certainly can't trust you. But on the lower level, but it gets at the issue that you're raising, right? Our expectations around who does what produces our sense about the level of stigma that should be attached to them. I think we need to do a lot more in terms of who who these folks are, what communities they're coming from, what's the nature of stigma. I do think that there are there's probably some research that suggests that there's greater stigma for some groups than others. I think there's some stuff done on parenthood, for instance, on children who have parents who have been incarcerated, and if memory serves, white children experience that much worse if their father has been incarcerated than a black child might experience the same thing. But I think you're right, we should pay more attention to what the nature of the stigma and how it shapes how people behave in the labor market more than we have. I agree. I would love to get data or money to be able to look at that question. So great question, thank you. I can't address it though. Other questions? Okay, office hours then. Okay. Thank you very much.
All right, our final presentation for discussion is from Erin Kerrison. Happy to introduce her to all of you. She's an assistant professor who's just joined us recently in the School of Social Welfare. Her work extends from a large epidemiological framework where she looks at law and legal institutions and how they operate to determine certain aspects of health. Specifically, her mixed method research agenda investigates the impact that compounded structural advantage, concentrated poverty, and state supervision has on service delivery, substance abuse, violence, and other health outcomes for individuals and communities, marked by the criminal justice intervention.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm two things. I'll be quick because I know I'm keeping you between Amy's wisdoms and happy hour. And second, I'm only sitting because despite the size of my goggles, I can't read what's on the screen if I'm standing, if this isn't on the podium. So I'm not being like flip and like I don't care. I'm just sitting so that I can read. Thank you for the introduction, Leora. Let us jump in. So as far as what my research looks at, as Leora graciously offered, I studied punishment, and I studied the ways in which, in particular, the criminal justice system has tremendous fallout for individual and aggregated community level health outcomes, particularly for folks who are multi-marginalized. And so this particular project and the men and women who I'm going to talk to you about today, they're all drug-involved offenders who have served time in the state of Delaware, if not elsewhere, in the mid-1990s at the very least, if not even more recently. So that's the framework as far as who I'm going to talk about. And though Delaware is a very tiny state in the United States, it's definitely a national story with respect to employment restrictions, service sector labor market expansion, as well as Rust Belt deindustrialization. So something to think about with respect to how generalizable these findings are. I just wanted to make sure that we know. So Sandra primes my presentation so nicely, so I won't even get into all the collateral consequences, the 40,000 plus laws on the books that exclude people from meaningful labor engagement. I want to talk instead about, in addition to those second sentences, as Jeremy Travis calls them, being served by men and women with criminal records, that in the private sector, in particular, there's all sorts of laws, either the presence of law or the absence of law, that makes full-time, fully, meaningfully engaged employment a possibility for folks with a criminal record. And specifically, I want to talk about employment at will, which is essentially you can hire or fire anyone for a good reason or bad reason or no reason at all. And insofar as the patterns are not identifiable in a systemic way, you can basically get away with that without any sort of scrutiny or audit. In addition, rules around exclusion for financial, health, and safety occupational sites. So with respect to insurance premiums that employers have to bear the burden of, there's a lot of focus, if you will, or concern around hiring what looks like a risky job candidate. And even the hiring incentives that exist for employers to take on folks with criminal records, just bless you, despite the presence of those incentives, they're negligible in comparison to the risk of negligence suits that an employer might face should said risky candidate, do their thing and show their spots eventually. And then also background checking. There's two huge issues in the law, in criminal law, around background checking. The first is that there's no kinds of protections offered to former offenders. So you and I can get on like Intellius and Superpages and whatever and pay an extra $20 to find information. So juveniles are protected, but even that we can argue isn't always the case. But adult offenders with criminal records, that's up for grabs. So there's no sort of protection on the books around making sure that we reserve some sort of privacy for these folks from mainstream searchers, employers, and otherwise landlords, et cetera. But also there's a ton of clerical errors. Anyone who's worked, besides Heather, with administrative data sets have seen all kinds of errors coming from at every level: probation, parole, from healthcare providers, from counselors, et cetera, within the system. And none of that is corrected, right? So unless you make a point of saying this is a problem, I'd like to have it scrubbed, I'd like to have it amended, something like that, and that you pay for it, that exists. And there's no sort of incentive for anyone within this framework to make these changes to make sure that this was the best sort of personal history for a former offender is available to folks who are searching. Right? So these are some of the issues that I want to talk about. And why this is important at all is because I believe that in the presence of a moment marked by deindustrialization within the Rust Belt, marked by the expansion of the service sector for which many of these former prisoners are completely ill-equipped, and then marked by collateral consequences legislation that makes getting a job, among a number of other sort of rights to citizenship, really infeasible, is that it can lead to this legal cynicism, which is essentially the idea that folks have, it's a cultural orientation where somewhere along the spectrum you believe law lies as inconsistent, as unreliable, as useless, et cetera, you know, all the way up to dismantling. And essentially what I want us to think about is how the causes and reach of legal cynicism exist beyond the criminal justice system, how they exist in the private sector with respect to insurance and employment. And there are two questions that are going to guide the study that we're going to talk about today. And the first is whether or not difficulty securing and keeping jobs leads to legal cynicism. And I'm also curious about the extent to which legal cynicism, has an impact on desistance. And the way I'm talking about desistance today is a de-escalation from criminal offending and/or substance abuse for this particular population. So, in particular, does law make legitimate labor market participation appear to be an unwise investment of time and energy, which again segues very, very nicely from Sandra's points raised. So as far as the data set that I'm using is concerned, this is from a mixed method analysis. It's the Rhodes Diverge study. Ronette Bachman is the PI out of University of Delaware, and this is a National Institute of Justice funded study that was basically put forth where we did look at about 12,500 folks who had gone through therapeutic community programming in an array of prison facility settings in the state of Delaware in the mid-1990s. And what we wanted to do was look at the mechanisms for change or for persistence that exist within this cohort of men and women who were coming through reentry through a number of different presidential administrations and a number of different passages of laws, as well as treatment programming incentives. So a lot was going on in this time period, and we wanted to see, for this group of men and women, what was going on. So this existed in two ways. The first was to first identify the application of the identity theory of desistance for men and women. So there's competing ideas around how, not just why people desist, but what are the mechanisms by which they arrive at desistance. And some of the dominant criminological literature definitely cites employment, marriage, military involvement, et cetera, as really, really meaningful. Cognitive change around changing your narrative scripts and how you see yourself. I'm evoking Shed Maruna here. And what we wanted to see is whether or not the extent to which individual personal change by which you imagined a future self that is healthy, that is a pro-social citizen, that is with your children, that is engaged in work that can actually help you pay your rent, et cetera, the extent to which you could pursue those goals once you reconcile the proximity of the feared self, which is the person who dies alone in prison, the person who is completely ostracized and removed from their family and any sort of pro-social network, et cetera. And the reason why we wanted to do this to see, or to measure how the mechanism for desistance might be different in a setting where employment is not necessarily getting folks the leg up that they would have in years prior. Or finding marriageable partners that are actually pro-social is not really, you're not in that sort of dating pool necessarily. So looking for the applicability of a new desistance theory that could explain desistance trends for contemporary drug-involved offenders. So the study unfolded in 2 phases. The first is with the full sample, like I mentioned, about 12,500 men and women released from Delaware Department of Corrections in the mid-1990s. So this is their baseline release from prison is what I'm referring to here on out. Official Delaware arrest and incarceration records, including those from the NCIC, so the National Crime Information Center, which basically would capture any sort of criminal movement or criminal justice intervention, if you will, outside of Delaware, which makes sense for folks who are in Maryland and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, Virginia, et cetera, et cetera. And from those data, controlling for days out and exposure, we developed 5 offending trajectories, which I'll show you in a moment. Phase 2 of the study includes a subsample of approximately 300 men and women, representative of along race, gender, and offending trajectory groups, to sit down with us for about an hour and a half and be interviewed on their entire reentry experience, and those interviews took place between 2010 and 2011. Okay. So to give you a flavor of who we're talking to, for the full sample, it's a largely male sample, it's a largely black sample, not unlike what you saw in Michigan with the earlier study showed today. It's very much white or black, a little bit of Asian, a little bit of Latino, but for the purposes of statistical power, in these analyses, I'm going to show you differences between white and black for the numbers. And the mean age at baseline release for the men and women of the sample was just shy of 30 years old. And their mean age at the end of the observation period, all that official Delaware and NCIC data from 1990 to 2008, included men and women who were about 43 and a half years old at that time. So these are the models for the full sample of that 18-year observation period. And what you can see here on the x-axis is the years, on the y-axis a little bit cut off on the screen, but the mean number of arrests per year. So these trajectory models are derived from those official data collected from Delaware and NCIC. And what you'll see here, what I'll point out are the 2 persisting groups, what we're calling persisting groups, yellow and the green lines, where over this 20-year period, folks are exhibiting at least 1.5 arrests per year. And then the 3 desisting groups, the red, purple, and blue groups, of which I think it's about 65% of the sample, by the end of the observation period, they're averaging fewer than half of an arrest, whatever that means, per year. I don't know what half of an arrest looks like. So these are the offending trajectory groups that I'm going to be talking about. So based on those distinctions in offending patterns, I wanted to see the extent to which employment has any kind of effect on the likelihood that they belong to one of those groups, persisting or desisting. And in order to do so, from that data set, I'm looking particularly at the employment variable, number controls on the right, but employment is operationalized as working full or part-time 6 months post that baseline release. And you might ask, why 6 months when you have 20 years worth of arrest and incarceration data? And the reason is twofold. The first is that that's the largest number of folks who are around with all the different waves of data collected. Anyone's working with this kind of population knows about sample attrition. But theoretically also and empirically we know that that 6 months following prison release is incredibly precarious with respect to securing employment, securing housing, staying clean, et cetera, et cetera. So 6 months I feel confident is a good time to look at. And then for the logit regression, I'm using that high persisting group as the reference category, that yellow line, group 5. Okay, so the likelihood of being in groups 1, 2, 3, 4 instead of 5 based on your employment status is what I'm looking at with these logit models that I'm going to show you in a second. And because I believe employment means something different for different demographic groups, I've disaggregated these models by gender and by race. Okay. So the takeaway here is essentially employment has no demonstrable effect on the likelihood of being in groups 1, 2, 3, or 4 relative to the likelihood of being in that high persisting reference group, with the exception of black men in the mid-level desisting group. And I'll note too, for the low-level desisting group, sort of the most well-behaved group of black men in the sample, that neared significance. It was at 0.58, but I'm not going to report it as significant, or 0.058, excuse me, because it wasn't. So if there's a story around redemption or second chances, particularly relative to black male counterparts who don't have a criminal record, this idea of I got a job and it meant something to me, I suppose there could be a story in there. It's not popping up in these data and the interviews, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the Q&A if you're interested in discussing that. But the larger story for this sample, both in sum but also disaggregated by gender and race, is that employment does not seem to have a demonstrable effect on the likelihood that you'll be in a desisting group instead of the most deviant reference group. So questions I had about why that might be the case. First could be about the numbers for sure. It could be a statistical power issue. It could be that those trajectory models are based on official arrest records, and we all know that those are deflated, sort of capture what's actually happening with offending activity, so maybe that's the issue. I'll totally concede that. There's also the issue of what the quality of employment looks like, so just because you're working full or part-time 6 months post-baseline release doesn't mean that that job is an amazing job that's netting you, a livable wage that you're proud of, and also that it can compete with the very real full-time job of satisfying an addiction, right? Remember, I'm talking about a drug-involved cohort of men and women. And then also the issue of social capital and social network insufficiencies, which lovely Sandra touched on right before I presented, so I don't have to go too deep into it, but the idea of the extent to which you can tap people to help you get a good job is something that's really important. But I have a sneaking suspicion that it had something to do with the law, particularly because there's very little in the literature that looked at it, and particularly given all the changes that we had seen in the law with respect to what it means to have a criminal record, I thought merited some scrutiny. So particularly interested in what's going on with felony reporting mandates, the assessment of risk within the private service sector for folks with criminal records around drugs and property offenses, and also the blanket exclusion from a host of different employment positions, as I mentioned earlier, in health, child care, and in financial domains for folks with felony drug charges. So these are all things where there's law in the books that makes it very, very difficult, if not impossible, for you to get a job if any of these criteria are met. This is what I want to look at in the qualitative data. So I mentioned about 300 folks were interviewed. They sat for about an hour and a half for semi-structured conversations, interviews in our offices. All of the interviews were transcribed verbatim and inputted in vivo, my favorite software package, and then analyzed using holistic thematic codes with parent nodes, so large things like victimization, for instance, and then branches within those tree nodes around victimization as a child, or victimization as an adult, or victimization while incarcerated, etc. And a particular interest to me for this study was the extent to which folks talked about, at the time of their interview, that they were still involved in criminal activity and or substance abuse within the last 12 months. So if you're being interviewed, July of 2011, what's your activity been like? Have you desisted from crime, if you will, and that includes de-escalation since July of 2010, okay? And then to what extent does law, I'm not even gonna move that, forget it, have a role in that, or in those outcomes. Oh, thank you, Joshua. Justin. No, Joshua. Justin. Joshua. Thank you, I got it right, sorry. Thank you very much. So to give you a taste of who I spoke to, it's a representative sample of the larger 12,500 men and women who were interviewed. The mean age at the time of interviews is 61 years. Response rate, 96% of those who were tried or who we attempted to contact. And we were really, really rigorous. I mean, sending letters. We had 2 folks on the team who were part of the original therapeutic community counseling team. So they knew how to find folks. This one works at the grocery store. This one's always at this barber shop. This one's at this pool hall. So we were really, really aggressive in tracking down folks. And I'm really proud of that response rate. And the self-reported deviant activity for what could be coded from the interviews was that more than half of the sample was still using drugs at the time they sat for that interview in 2010 and 2011, and a quarter of the sample admitted to being engaged in criminal activity. Right? So let's get into the whys that I was curious about with respect to what could explain those numbers, right? That 54% of folks are still using drugs, despite the fact that we have a very large desisting sample, if you will, where 70% of people were in groups 1, 2, or 3. And a lot of people talked at length about bearing the brunt of pressures related both to background checking, of course, but this at-will employment. So Mark, for instance, knew that he's working in this contract sort of setting where he has a gig, I think it's like a 90-day, 12-week sort of thing, something like that. And he knows that when it comes time to keep things lean, I think he was working, it was like around this time of year, Christmas tree stuff, so that's what it was. So everything sort of stops right after the holidays. He was working at a nursery, and people don't buy wreaths and Christmas trees or whatever after that. The ground is dead in January in Delaware. So he knew that this was coming. But he'd been really serious about taking these classes on horticulture and botany and all this stuff, and so he could be beefed up for customer service. He's really, really proud of all of this. So he says to me that he's here at the front of the classroom, or he was called to the front of the classroom. It was interrupted as he's learning to train to do this work. That he has this record, and that's essentially why he can't work anymore. So he was asked, despite being hired, he was asked, did your record ever interfere with you getting a job that you know of? And he says, oh yeah, I've definitely been embarrassed. A couple years ago, they called me to the front of the class and they said, we just ran your record and you're not, It was the second day I was there. I thought I had that job and they let me go. People act a certain way with me, and then I get a call in a couple days and it's like a completely different person on the phone once they found out. It gets real old after a while. And I think what's important to note here with Mark and other folks like him, is it gets real old after a while. So he's in the desisting trajectory. He's a mid-level desister, a white man in his late 40s. But he's talked about the fatigue of job hunting in this space where on day 2, despite your best intentions, someone will call you up to the front of this botany class and say, something, it's not actually going to work out. And the extent to which that can temper your job search and your willingness to continue to look for jobs and find gainful employment or, legit employment above the table, I think is something that we have to think about if that's worth it or not for these folks in their eyes. So with risk and liability, desperate from the unending search for viable employment, some of the folks, particularly women who are niched into these labor markets marked by childcare and healthcare service provision, talked about how they're completely hamstrung in their search because they cannot get a job in these spaces working with vulnerable populations. So this is Cindy, who got her CNA and is talking about how she had to lie in order to get this job and why she had to lie. So she says, and she's being cynical here with talking about applying herself in job seeking, because earlier in the interview she's saying how fruitless that is in the face of a context that's basically stacked against you. But she says, we actually had to go out and apply ourselves for job seeking and whatnot. I went up there and I had taken a course while I was in prison for my CNA, that's my certified nursing assistance license. And I got my license and that made me available to them. I got it as a cardiovascular technician. They never knew, meaning they never knew about her criminal record. You just write whatever you need to write on the application. I mean, your life, you might be doing right, but you still tell some lies along the way to get what you want, for real, for real. People don't know that, but they do. And the interviewer asked, this was a full-time job, did it come with benefits? And she says, life insurance and health insurance. And then she's asked again, so you got that job all your own? And she says, laughing, admitting that she had to lie to do so. But essentially what I'm interested in is, you might be doing right, you still have to tell some lies along the way. There's a lot of conversation around harm reduction and negotiating of hustles, and doing what you needed to do to just get your foot in the door that I'm sure lots of POs wouldn't be thrilled with, but is a very real circumstance for these men and women who are trying to navigate this legal landscape that just keeps them out of these employment opportunities. And lastly, I'll talk about background checking, which is a huge, huge problem for a couple of reasons that I mentioned earlier, all of the clerical records and the extent to which they're just available to everybody. But also that for folks who really do know, I could get rid of this if I just had the money, if I just had the game plan, if I just had sort of the wherewithal and the connection to clean this up. Knowing that you are that close to a clean record and not being able to get things sorted was something that came up as a really common refrain and dissuaded people from continuing to look in this space where they knew they were going to be discriminated against, even if there was a mistake that they couldn't fix. So this is Darius, who's asked, you have a drug charge on your record, and he says, I thought about trying to get it expunged. It was a felony when it should have been. It was dismissed to a misdemeanor, but it's still on the books as a felony from earlier. I thought about trying to get it expunged, or whatever you call it, but it's up to them if they want to do it, this being the municipal agencies. I'm not going to waste money to try to get it done if they're not even behind me. He has to go through all these hoops to show the paperwork that it's been discharged to a misdemeanor. That's money going to hell, so I feel kind of bad. And so then he's asked, well, how so? You know, why do you feel bad? Because I can't go nowhere and find a job without them knowing that, because they're going to find out if you lie to them. So he's not willing to take the risks of our friend one slide earlier. And say you don't have a drug charge or charges, they're going to find out anyways. Those rules weren't written for us. So this kind of detachment and cynicism, if you will, around making these efforts to fit in a space where no matter what, your perception is that you're going to be excluded because of assumptions that employers have about you. Even if you say, look, this is wrong, I could fix it if I had the money, is essentially what he goes on to say. And he is in the persisting group with a side hustle, a small sort of handicapping, thank you, bookie gambling circuit. That's what he's been doing at the time of the interview anyways. All right. So I will wrap up and talk about some of the findings and what I think could possibly happen. So based on, and this is, I know I gave you 3 slides, I promise I wrote a whole dissertation on this, so there's more examples than that. But there appears to be some pretty strong support for legal cynicism within this population around having desistance efforts exacerbated by the presence or absence of law that they feel that would protect them and empower them to find this work. And this exists in statutory law with respect to the collateral consequences and punishment connected to having felony drug charges or property offenses. The private sector's reliance upon concern over insurance liability, and also their resistance to reintegrate. And I put re in parentheses on purpose because I'm not convinced that everybody was in the fold before they got to prison in the first place. But basically no sort of mandate that would require them to bring in this risky population. And then also that the positive elements of employment might be dampened by its perceived, and by that I mean lack of, relative value. So any of the kind of supervisory effects that employment would provide, like there are things I just don't want to do because I don't want to lose my job as an assistant professor at UC Berkeley, right? If that's not the kind of job that I had, there might be some risks that I'd be willing to take. So this idea of these I'm like outing myself. Wow! No, very boring. The idea that having a job as a hook for change is something you can hang your hat on, it may not have that same metal in this group when people just have bad jobs. 10 weeks of cutting down Christmas trees where you can get snatched up on day 2 of classes anyways. I have some beef with Ban the Box. I don't know that it has much teeth, and it's rolling out everywhere. The issue is there's a too little too late aspect. You gotta find the problem before you know the problem. So I feel like Ban the Box often relies on audits, like these after the fact kind of cleanup endeavors that I don't think are particularly useful when we have people are excluded from the job. It's not just about like, oh, did you give them a chance with or without this record? It's by law they cannot be hired. And that's something that I want us to think about when we think about policy and trying to do something preemptive around employment reintegration as opposed to reactively or in response to. There's also this issue of meaningful job training and employer matching. So folks are doing stuff inside. First of all, the programming for employment and vocational training is already limited. But it seems pretty silly to give someone a CNA license when she has a felony drug charge and is not going to get anywhere near a prescription cabinet, right? So that seems like a huge waste of time and money, and that kind of thing plays out constantly in training. And then background checking restrictions, of course, the extent to which the state is invested in protecting folks who are making efforts to reintegrate as a public safety issue, if that were added to that bill that way. I think that could reframe some of the incentives or desire to protect folks. And I'm also wondering about the I have a colleague, she's a medical anthropologist, Helena Hansen at NYU, who talks about the war on drugs that wasn't, which is essentially the opioid and synthetic opioid epidemic, if you will, that we're seeing among white folks, particularly young white folks, who are abusing Vicodins and Oxycontins and Percocets and all these kinds of things. And the extent to which they're coming up on criminal justice intervention, or negotiating sort of those impacts, coupled with our ideas around illness and medicalizing their deviant behavior. So, I mean, I don't know that the ADA is going to launch something saying that these 19-year-old drug addicts who got strung out after they had their wisdom teeth extracted are sick instead of criminal. But I'm curious about sort of trends and shifts and the ways in which laws accommodate those who they like. So I'm just curious to see what your thoughts are, and something that I'm thinking of in the back of my head is drug-involved offender populations get lighter and lighter and lighter. How will we respond to their integration efforts in the future? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, so a little bit about timing. I'm sensitive because Amy has to leave at some point because she has childcare issues to deal with. So just like a couple minutes for Erin, and then let's move to sort of our broader discussion. Questions? Ron?
I'd like to hear a little more about, I didn't understand what you said about the ban the box
Oh, sure.
intervention. So,
What do you mean when I said it's toothless, or?
yeah.
Right. So
I mean, if it were really done, would it be helpful? Or are you saying there are legal obstacles to hiring?
Yeah, so the issue is we're going to evaluate, ban the box proponents say, let's evaluate candidates on the merits of their application, right? And if need be, where there's a background check where criminal record is a criteria that's of concern for us, we'll get to it at that point. But the idea is we're going to stop filtering and screening folks who have to check that felony conviction box on the application. And my argument is multifold. First, that some folks, and Amanda Egan and Sonia Starr have some research coming out about this right now, that people have proxies for criminal records, like tattoos and big gaps in their resumes, where it's like it stinks right there, it's in front of you, that they're absolutely, or there's some sort of discrepancy that you would imagine is due to some criminal justice intervention. Or they just believe this is a black man who looks about this age, this size, probably a criminal. There's that. And then there's also just the legal aspect that if you are ineligible to work in this site, you know, despite having your certified nursing assistant license, there's nothing that a ban the box initiative can do about that. So that's my argument around it's sort of toothless.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah.
So, in terms of employer choice, it's, I suppose, rational that an employer would choose someone without a criminal record versus somebody with a criminal record. So
Depending on your ethics,
it suggests that employers would have to be created that would not have that same choice set. So the government, for example. So are there examples of government programs that are somehow non-discriminatory, that favor or that are open to both classes, ex-felons and non-ex-felons?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that's pretty much where ban the box initiatives are unfolding. So as far as getting other folks open to the idea of hiring them, that's some of these tax incentives where, you know, if you hire this population, you have this sort of write-off, if you will. I'm doing this really, really simply. It's much more complicated than that. But barring that, people are not incentivized. You know, so the federal government.
State employment.
Same thing. Same thing. But there's still the issue of the population with which you'll be working. So, for instance, if you're working for the state and they handle all the casino licensing, gambling stuff, like that's a state-run effort. You can't do that with your property offenses. So even within the federal and state and municipal labor market, there's still these legal restrictions on what you can do, and they tend not to be doing the like startup sort of jobs where anybody, and I say anybody, now there's like coding programs in prison to get people into tech. But the state and the government jobs at large typically tend to be ones, or more likely tend to be ones where these legal restrictions are still going to be in play.
This is sort of a speculative question, but I'm wondering if any thoughts on this sort of policy idea of kind of positive credentialing. So the idea, this is from a paper by Bushway that was in Criminology and Public Policy a few years ago, where the idea is to give people an opportunity to create a positive credential to counteract the negative one, right? And I think part of it is not just sort of eliminating the stigma, but also giving the person involved sort of a pathway towards sort of a clean slate and a clear view. So I'm wondering what you think about it from a policy perspective, and also whether you could project onto your subjects, whether that would be something they would have found useful.
Sean and I fight about this a little bit.
Okay.
But so the deal is that you would basically have like a personal statement. So in like your SAT scores and whatever aren't so great, you can sort of fluff it up with this essay. Just being really cynical. And the problem is there's still like buzzwords that I feel like are buzz characteristics that I don't believe multi-marginalized folks can tap into, with the exception of like veteran status. So let me clean this up. You still need to leverage the construction of a dossier. So whatever that would mean might include some sort of affidavit from an employer, or a counselor rather, who's like, you know what, they've been showing up all the time and they've made these incredible strides. Or if you're staying in a shelter or a halfway house or something like that, whoever the director is would say, this person makes curfew all the time, this and that. What Sean and other folks are proposing with this positive credentials, it still requires a social capital, or a level of social capital and social networks that I don't know that hyper-marginalized folks can tap into. I think the idea would be great if there were institutional supports for everyone coming out of prison, but the issue is that idea is relying on the generosity and the devotion of folks beyond that candidate to actually like care and put something on paper, or to shuttle people through the job search process. And to the extent that that is not institutionalized, I don't know that it can happen. I think it creates unfair advantages for folks with with criminal records who have social network and social capital access that those with criminal records who don't have that access to, wouldn't see benefits conferred. Make sense? I don't want to mess up it because you gotta get.
Yeah, right.
You can never mess me up.
Noah's gonna kill me. Oh wait, go get Noah. Go get Noah.
Do you want me to just move on?
Can I briefly introduce you?
Sure.
Sorry, I jumped the gun.
So I want people to get to know people.
Thank you.
So let's just stand and thank Nora for organizing this wonderful meeting. And the hard work.
And Liz Vasile, who also did a lot of hard work on this, really, and all the organization, and makes this pleasant. She's not responsible for the smoke that bubbled in here later.
Thank you.
I was like, I smell smoke.
No, I think they started the fireplace downstairs, and it just seems to go up through the floors, and I will talk to you about it. All right, well, thank you.